well, this seems like a good video to finally do. If there's ever a chance to combine games with an iconic British television series, you know I'll be there sooner or later. And The Crystal Maze was one of my absolute favourite shows as a child, something that had to be watched every week it was on. It's still very fondly remembered, a show that hasn't aged badly at all, and there'll certainly be a bit of a time to reminisce about the original classic one. However, the main subject of this vid probably isn't as well remembered, the games based on the TV show, for there were actually a decent handful of curious presentations indeed. There's a run of free arcade games that you might possibly remember playing, and there's also a rather obscure DOS game. A decent amount of things to get through then, so it's time for us to start running, for no real reason at all, to the first zone, and take a good look back at the show itself. Now, I imagine that for a lot of people watching, The Crystal Maze doesn't need much of an introduction, but it's nice to have a premiere for those who may not be familiar with it. The show ran on Channel 4 from 1990 to 1995, and it's one of the best game shows that the UK has ever produced. The idea for it came after Channel 4 and production company Chatsworth originally wanted to do a version of the French show Fort Boyard, but after a pilot didn't really go to plan, they went back to the drawing board and devised a variation on the format with original Boyard creator and game show genius Jacques Antoine, who'd also designed other popular running about a lot shows like Treasure Hunt and cult classic Interceptor. You have a team of 6 people running about and playing individual games in 4 zones: Aztec, Futuristic, Medieval and Industrial, which was replaced by the Ocean Zone later on. Contestants can play either a physical, skill, mental or mystery game, and they can take a lot of forms: shooting down targets, crossing treacherous water-filled pits, lots of sliding block and volume-based puzzles, solving a fortune teller's riddles. There's plenty of good ones. The team wins a crystal for each successful game, which gives them 5 seconds of time in the final game and centrepiece, the Crystal Dome. They cross that bridge over the water, Richard O'Brien shouts, "Will you start the fans, please?" And they have to collect gold tokens as they're blown about while avoiding silver ones. If they end up with 100 gold after the silver ones are deducted, they win, and they get some sort of activity-based prize as a reward, which is nice. I mean, it's hardly Bully's fashion shopping spree, but it makes sense to have an activity as a prize for winning on an activity-based show, even if the activity itself is crap. And if they lose, well, they do at least get a Swarovski crystal with "I cracked the Crystal Maze" engraved on it. The show was brilliant for several reasons. Channel 4 didn't skimp at all on the production, creating a huge and lush set that was probably the biggest in Europe at the time, and spending plenty of money, which absolutely shows in the end product. Like any good game show, it's a great one for shouting at the television. You'll be right there with the team as they try to offer advice to whoever's playing the game, even if they can't actually hear you. The pressures of time and plain old foolishness make for some classic moments of failure, the sort of thing that goes down in infamy. The one who couldn't figure out a basic water puzzle and turning the taps round, the guy who can't see U3 even though it's right in front of his face, that woman who falls spectacularly in the water in the title sequence, and possibly best of all, this one fella who reaches for a reflection of a crystal instead of, the crystal that's actually there. It's amazing how a game show makes people fail at basic human tasks, really. The biggest reason of all, however, was Richard O'Brien. An unconventional game show host for sure, Mr. Rocky Horror Picture Show was the perfect maze master. Playfully malevolent, almost like a Time Lord who'd settled on Earth and got a job on network television, and very much in with the audience with his playful asides and antics to the camera, something that he improvised from the first episode onwards, initially without the knowledge of the production crew. Playing the harmonica, making references to Mumsy, encouraging the team whilst being more realistic about their chances to the viewer. He ended up being the perfect host for this different sort of game show. I mean, let's face it, you could hardly have had Bruce Forsyth hosting the Crystal Maze now, could you? The show appealed to just about everybody. While it was primarily aimed at adults, kids also loved it, and episodes were shown twice a week, with the original slot on Thursdays at 8:30, and a more kid-friendly repeat slot on Sundays at 6 p.m. The success of the show with children also meant that when it came to special holiday editions, Channel 4 chose to run children's specials as opposed to letting D-list celebrities arse about on the set, and they didn't make the games any easier for the kids either. The original run of the show lasted for 6 series and 83 episodes, not all that long in the grand scheme of game shows. The beginning of the end perhaps came when O'Brien left after the 4th series because he wished to go back to being an actor. While he was replaced by another unconventional host in the shape of Ed Tudor Pole, it wasn't really the same. I don't think Ed did a bad job personally, but he had absolutely impossible shoes to fill. When the show finished, it perhaps could have gone on longer commercially, but really it was stopped before any serious rot occurred, finishing when it wasn't that far removed from its prime. There was a revival in the 2010s, starting with a one-off Stand Up to Cancer special, and continuing on with a full return hosted by Richard Ayoade, which was good and bad. It still had a vibe, and Ayoade was his own sort of maze master, as opposed to a Richard O'Brien imitation, which was good. But it did have too many of the D-list celebrities arsing around, the sort of thing that wouldn't have happened back in the day. This revival's gone now too, but the original still stands as one of the UK's most celebrated game shows, if not one of its most celebrated TV shows, full stop. It was absolutely unmissable television. But are the games equally unmissable? Or should they be automatically locked in and left to rot? Let's have a look at them now. As far as video games go, we have 4 Crystal Maze titles, 3 from the arcade row and 1 from the computer row. All of them are a little unconventional and not the sort of games we usually cover. I am pretty sure that the arcade Crystal Maze games are the first SWP arcades that we've ever covered, meaning that they're skill with prizes games. Yes, if you play this game and you come out victorious, you can actually win some money. There's a £5 jackpot for anyone who can play the title to the end and get enough gold tokens. And all I can say is, good luck, cause boy are you gonna need it. The 3 Crystal Maze arcades were made by Barcrest, a UK company from Ashton-under-Lyne that's probably the most famous name in British slot machines, and they came out between 1992 and 1994. All of them are trackball games, and it's only recently that they've been playable on MAME. As detailed by the almighty David Mame Hayes Hayward, long-time MAME developer Ryan the Mogminer Holtz kind of accidentally fixed the Crystal Maze in 2020 while improving the software's Fairlight CMI emulation, landing on a key component that the arcade's board shared. Being a Barcrest game, it's kind of an interesting setup. What we have is a PCB that you would usually find in a fruit machine, but it's one in a video board as opposed to reels. Annoyingly, I don't have a proper trackball controller and have to make do with my mouse, and unfortunately this does make some of the games a little bit tricky to play. Things like the ball mazes are hard enough, but they're kind of impossible with a mouse. Anywho, this is a game that you play for 5 minutes, as the attract mode tells you. You go through each of the 4 zones and you pick what sort of game you want to play. I think you usually get around 7 separate mini-games before the dome. There's 2 in most zones, but it seems like you only get 1 in another. The games themselves are fairly self-explanatory, but that doesn't mean they aren't difficult. You get things like word searches and concentration, but you've also got colour matching puzzles, the aforementioned mazes, parts where you have to shoot down the right targets to reach the top, walking in a line and avoiding rocks from the ceiling, and other assorted japes. The time for each game ranges from a minimum of 30 seconds to a maximum of 1.5 minutes, and that tight scale can make just about anything pretty challenging just on its own. The aesthetic is kind of fun. The games are hardly lookers, but you certainly do get a lot of pictures of Richard O'Brien looking very intimidating as he guides you through the zones, and you do get an AY chip version of the iconic Crystal Maze music, Forcefield by Zach Lawrence. There are some games where, relatively speaking, it's a little bit easier to obtain a crystal. Swapping letters around to solve an anagram isn't often too bad a time, and you should be alright at the tile matching games if you're any good at concentration. Some of the others? Well, when the game gives you all of 30 seconds to unlock the doors in a maze to get a crystal, you do wonder if that's even possible at all. Still, the arcade does categorise the games by their difficulty behind the scenes, and that's going to factor into your chance of winning in the dome. If you only succeed in the easier games, then when the tokens get blown up in the air at the end, well, you'll probably see far more silver ones than gold, and you will have absolutely bob-ope, no hope of winning anything at all. If you manage to complete the tougher games, well, you'll actually see more gold tokens, and you might have a prayer. Chances are pretty good that you'll only have 2 or 3 crystals by the time you get to the dome, mind, so you best get hammering the button when you reach that final game. Turns out that winning actual money is hard. Who'd have thought it? A second version of this game would be released in 1993 called The New Crystal Maze, featuring Ocean Zone. There's not a huge amount of difference here. Obviously, you now have the Ocean Zone instead of the Industrial Zone, and you have a few new graphics here and there, but generally speaking, most of the minigames haven't been changed all that much. I think there's a couple of tweaks, but if anything, they make the game tougher. It seems like you get a lot less time on average to complete a minigame than you did in the original. Now obviously it would be a bit silly to say that this game's needlessly frustrating or unfair or anything like that. I mean, it's an SWP game after all. Real money's at stake, and of course it's going to be bloody difficult. Anyway, the third and final game from 1994 is a little different. The Crystal Maze Team Challenge does feature a bunch of new minigames, such as top-down mazes and sliding puzzles. Nothing groundbreaking, but it's what you would expect. You also get an actual group to control with cartoon portraits, choosing the game you want by picking them instead of just going for physical or mystery or whatever, and the winning conditions are a little clearer. If you get over 70 gold tokens in the final game, then you can win £5. And as usual, yeah, it's not easy in the slightest. Seeing as Richard O'Brien wasn't hosting the TV show at this point, all of his pictures have been taken out, although sadly there aren't any new pictures of Ed Tudor Pole to replace them, which is a bit of a disappointment. Generally speaking, although there's slight technical improvements to the presentation, the game is mostly the same as the other two, which is what you would expect. The thing with these games is that, much like the show itself, they are really meant to be played with a group. Both the second and third Crystal Maze games allow for a maximum of 4 players to take part. There's other things in common with the show. You do have a big button marked escape that you'll need to press when the time starts to run out, and if you don't you will get locked in, and again, you'll only be brought back if the rest of the team gives up a crystal. The third game's the only one to have automatic locking conditions, although they are pretty easy to avoid. Generally a lock-in will only happen if you run out of bullets in a certain game or something along those lines, so you've just got to be mindful of that. These games aren't necessarily anything special, but I have a soft spot for them, as they do hit quite a specific nostalgia bone, not just one that's connected with the show. I have fond memories of playing one of these Crystal Maze machines, I believe it would have been the third one, back in the mid-90s at the AMF bowling alley on Southend Pier, and I used to have a great time with it, playing with me dad. I mean, it's an arcade game based on the Crystal Maze, so of course I enjoyed it. Unfortunately, in the summer of 1995, that Crystal Maze arcade machine burned down, along with the rest of the bowling alley, in the third big fire on Southend Pier thanks to an electrical fault. Thankfully no one was seriously injured, but the bowling alley was absolutely destroyed. Hell, I think I'd only last been there a couple of weeks or so before it happened. I'd always wanted to have a look at this game again, and had always been disappointed that it wasn't working in MAME, so even if it's not all that much to speak of, I am happy to finally get the chance to see it again after all these years, and very grateful to the MAME devs who are responsible. What about the computer game then? This one's actually not something I was aware of at all until very recently, to be honest. But yes, there was a Crystal Maze computer game, released in 1993 for PC-DOS and the Acorn Archimedes. The game was published by Shurston Software and developed by Digital Jellyfish Design. Two names that probably have you thinking, who the bloody hell are Shurston Software and Digital Jellyfish Design? Well, it appears as though Digital Jellyfish were a small studio based in New Zealand, at least going by their old website address, and Shurston were a UK-based publisher that specialised in educational software, starting out on the BBC Micro back in the early 80s. So again, this isn't something we often cover on the page. The Crystal Maze computer game is actually an edutainment title, and would have mostly been sold to and found in schools. The presence of the game on the highly edu-friendly Acorn Archimedes is certainly another big clue to that effect, and it does indeed appear that the Archimedes version is actually the original one, which makes sense looking at the company's history. Comments by Nick Westgate, one of the game's developers, on the few videos that there are of this title seem to confirm this. The game follows the usual layout of Fins: 4 zones, a couple of timed games in each, Crystal Dome at the end. The contestants this time are represented by some suitably kid-friendly caricatures, and you pick one of them to play a game. These characters do have strengths and weaknesses, although there's no real way to judge what those are beyond playing the various games with them. The range of games is about the same as what you get in the arcade series. All the physical games are basic platformer affairs. You get sliding puzzles and concentration, you have to click on the appropriate items in the mystery games, and so on. A couple of the games are a bit more familiar. You shoot targets down in the medieval zone, you roll balls down the chute to try and shut up the Aztec statues, and you might get the odd game of Snake or finding the sequence to turn off the lights in the futuristic zone. But not enough of these games, for me, are hugely faithful to what you would see on the show. I suppose you could say the same thing for a lot of the games in the arcade, although it's perhaps a bit more disappointing here. Another thing that's just not faithful to the show at all is the aesthetic. It's a bit of a shame that it just barely tries to recreate that much of anything when it comes to the show's look. You only get a few pictures and generic sound effects, and it does all look a bit like it was done on the cheap. The whole thing has this very low resolution, washed out look that's not aged well at all, and it makes those picture-based mystery games particularly annoying. The only character who might be in any way familiar is a recreation of Mumsy, appearing in the medieval zone to ask you a couple of questions. Neither Richard O'Brien nor Ed Tudor Pole can be found here, presumably because the publishers weren't able to get rights to their likenesses. That and... oh boy, playing this can be annoying. Good lord are some of these games hard. Some of that's down to some kind of ropey controls, particularly in the platform stages, but others like the target games are just plain irritating and obtuse. You may want to get familiar with the escape command if you don't want everyone to get trapped, although said command is control and escape. Now obviously this isn't actually a fault of the game, but that command might be a bit of a bother if you're playing this in DOSBox, as you might just end up opening the start menu. You can adjust the difficulty quite extensively with a slider, and there is also a practice mode where you can play the games as much as you want without fear of getting trapped. Surprisingly enough, for a game that's edutainment, you may well need to take advantage of these things in order to stand a chance. Eventually you will get to the dome itself, although I find that to be a bit odd. There doesn't actually seem to be that many tokens flying about, no matter where I moved. Much like a lot of this game, even the final denouement feels rather off. The disappointing thing, most of all, is how little it feels like the Crystal Maze. The wide variation in difficulty certainly does give dedicated players a hefty task when it comes to mastering this title, and that could be of interest to folks, but sadly it doesn't do a lot to stir up the imagination. It feels a bit too generic, and a few more touches from the show would have gone a long way. Hell, even the BarQuest arcades, games that aren't exactly far removed from their famous slot machines, did a significantly better job of that. Mind you, I may have had a bit more of a feeling for this game if I'd come across it as a kid, whether it was in school or somewhere else. It is still the Crystal Maze, after all. This isn't a well-known game in the slightest. I can't imagine it did that well, and the reviews I can find range from a couple of more positive notes, mostly from Acorn-based mags, to some pretty brutal takedowns from the likes of PC Zone. Shurston were charging 40 quid for the game back when it was new, and while there is a bit of meat here with the difficulty and such, a lack of variety in the games and the not all that appealing aesthetic does let it down, and I would struggle to say that it holds a candle to the majority of puzzle games on PC, or a good chunk of the better known edutainment games back then, I'm afraid. Now there are a couple of other little things to cover, including some games that I'm not able to cover here. There have been a couple of Crystal Maze mobile games over the years, although none of them seem to be around anymore, and at least one of them is iOS only. I've only got Android here, I'm afraid. I believe that there's also another pub quiz type game based on the show from 2009, but again, I've not got any way of playing that here. Going back to the time of the show, BarQuest did release a more conventional Crystal Maze themed fruit machine back in the day, and Milton Bradley had a board game from the early 90s that was loosely based on the Crystal Maze, that comes with all sorts of very simple little mini-games and so on. I've never seen this myself, but reviews are not exactly complimentary. It does differ wildly from the original show in that players compete against each other rather than working as a team. Apparently the more recent board game that came out in 2018 for the revival of the Crystal Maze is a considerably better and more complex affair that's a lot more faithful to the show. There was also a line of puzzle and quiz books based on the Crystal Maze back in the early 90s, most of which were written by Peter Arnold, and most of which are aimed more at the children's market, particularly the Crystal Maze Mystery line of adventure puzzles. There is even, oh yes, a Crystal Maze LCD game by Grandstand, which appears to be as simple as you would expect. I found virtually nothing about this, but it is on the YouTube channel of one Phil Newton England, who is, according to Challenge TV, the world's #1 fan of the Crystal Maze, and what he doesn't know about the show probably isn't worth knowing. He's got lots of assorted maze-based ephemera on his channel, and there is a link in the description, as well as one to the Crystal Maze fan group, another brilliant resource. Now, for all that's been covered so far, I have been missing what is perhaps the most authentic and in-depth way of playing the Crystal Maze for yourself without going on the show. The one that, shockingly, involves leaving the computer behind and getting out there, going outside. Of course, I'm talking about escape rooms and physical attractions. As far as the maze goes, there are two things to cover here, one from the past and one from the present. Back in the 1990s, there were several Crystal Maze cyberdromes. 5 of them were dotted around the UK, in places like Blackpool, Oakwood and Tenby, but there were also 2 in Japan, near Nagoya and Yokohama, and another one in Dubai. Fans of the show apparently absolutely loved this. I can find a good few detailed accounts from people who went to the cyberdromes. From what I can gather, the Cyberdrome contained a mix of physical games as well as games that were played on terminals. A session would last around about 40 minutes or so, and the role of Maze Master was taken by a computerised figure called Merlin. The setup hits on all the main features of the show. You've got the thematic zones, doing challenges individually while your fellow team members shout helpful advice at you, lots of running about everywhere to find the games and terminals, and of course, the dome at the end where instead of picking up tokens that get blown about, you have to rush around and press golden buttons that flash on and off. Every account that I can find of the Cyberdrome says that it was tons of fun and really captured the feel of the show to a T, undoubtedly far more so than any of the much more simple games we've looked at. But while they were very popular for a time, interest did naturally wane in them after the Crystal Maze left TV screens, and slowly but surely they all closed their doors. It appears that the one in Dubai, of all places, was the last one to shut up shop. However, with trends being the way they are, someone was bound to try again. As escape rooms became very popular around the start of the 2010s, surely there was a gap in the market for someone to try their take on UK television's most famous original escape complex. And so, that's how you get the Crystal Maze live experience from Little Line. First opened in London's West End in 2016 after a very successful crowdfunding campaign, there's also a second location at the Old Granada Studios in Manchester. The experience lasts a bit over an hour, and well, the guys behind it did the simple thing, really. They loved the Crystal Maze, and so they went ahead and recreated it, even getting Richard O'Brien himself in to welcome teams with a video. Puzzles are accurate to the show, there's a dome at the end, a whole set of maze masters to guide each team through the challenge. Yeah, it's the bloody Crystal Maze alright, and generally people love the whole thing. I can find very few negative reviews for it at all. There's some cool YouTube videos documenting the whole thing. The almighty Tristabytes has got one, YouTube megagroup The Sidemen went there, and the first one-off return of the Crystal Maze, the 2016 Stand Up to Cancer special hosted by Stephen Merchant, was filmed there, so there's plenty of vids out there where you can see it for yourself before going. It should be noted that Little Lion Entertainment are also responsible for the Tomb Raider live experience that opened up in Camden Stables Market last year. And with that, well, I think most of the zones in this video have been covered. While the Crystal Maze isn't currently on TV screens, whether in original or revived form, it still lives in some form or another, and nostalgia is always going to be very strong for it. The absolute anoraks of the game show form on the internet, UK game shows, have voted it the greatest British game show ever more than once, and it clearly deserves a place amongst the elite. For now though, it's time to put the harmonica down, make some tea, and have a chat with Mumsy. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and as ever, bye for now. I've covered movie tie-in games many times on this page, but Batman Returns is a special sort of affair, one that deserves a video all on its own. It might not exactly be a surprise that Batman Returns had a good few licensed games released for it. It's the sequel to a huge movie that shifted truckloads of merchandise, and the original 1989 Batman itself had 6 separate games across various platforms that were directly related to the movie, which is itself a pretty big number. But Batman Returns obliterates that. Counting them all up, from the 16-bits to Tiger Electronics, I believe that there are 10 separate Batman Returns based games. You've got a bunch of side-scrollers, some of which are pretty close to each other, a couple of beat-em-ups, a driving game, even a point-and-click adventure. That's a lot. I'm not sure if Batman Returns is the film with the most tie-in games associated with it, but it's surely got to be up there. So, well, let's look at the lot. It's a good range. You've got well-known classics, underrated gems, the odd bit of controversy, and naturally some titles that would have been best left in the old Bat bin. And this isn't just going to be a plain old summary. We're going deep into the catacombs with these games, with plenty of development tales to be told along the way. Let's begin with the obvious top title, the one that most everyone probably knows immediately. Konami's SNES Batman Returns game was released quite a while after the film, even after its home video release. It came out between February and May of 1993, depending on where you were. Konami already had something of a pedigree when it came to licensed beat-em-ups, primarily in the arcade. And indeed, in the last video, it was mentioned that they could have potentially made an arcade Batman beat-em-up if Atari hadn't beaten them to the rights for a Bat-based arcade game. As it is, particularly seeing as Batman Returns actually doesn't have an arcade game, we have to be content with this SNES effort. And I say content, but this is one of the SNES's best beat-em-ups. The game takes you through 7 scenes from the movie. Most of the time you'll be duking it out against the many varied goons of the Red Triangle Gang, and you'll be doing so in various different manners, from more traditional left-to-right beat-em-up stages, to single plane stages where you're limited to the Batarang, and even a single scene where you take control of the Batmobile. There's plenty of boss fights, from the Triangle's top strongmen and organ grinders to a couple of showdowns with Catwoman, the Penguin's duck vehicle, and finally old Oswald himself, right in the middle of his lair in Arctic World. The game itself was created by a largely very different team from those who worked on Konami's arcade beat-em-ups, although you can find plenty of good games on their CVs. Director Yoshio Yoshimoto previously was a planner on the Famicom's excellent Kid Dracula, and there's all sorts of other titles dotted around, including more beat-em-up based affairs like Monster in My Pocket and the SNES version of Turtles in Time. There is a pretty big effort to make the play in Batman Returns different from what you would normally see in an arcade game like, say, The Simpsons or Bucky O'Hare. The different segments in stages have already been mentioned, but even if there's usually only the most rudimentary bits of platforming, being limited to the Batarang does change things up, and it also helps to make this game a fair bit longer than your typical arcade brawler. The Caped Crusader also has considerably more moves than Konami's norm. Naturally, he can punch, kick and grab enemies, throwing them about or even grabbing 2 enemies at once for a very satisfying noggin knocker, but he's got several special abilities. A twirl of the cape clears crowds at the cost of some life, while Bats also has a choice of using either the Batarang, which stuns enemies from afar in normal stages, or a grappling hook that produces another special attack. Again, there's a little bit of life toll to pay for that. He can also block attacks and use the explosive test tube as a special weapon, although this comes in quite limited quantities. There's plenty of enemies on screen, and even if they aren't exactly imaginatively named, there's a whole load of thin clowns, fat clowns, tall clowns, knife throwers and so on. It feels very good to give them the old knuckle sandwich, especially when you can also chuck them directly into the ground or even into the background. Other little things like the Batmobile stage help change things up a bit too, certainly makes sure that the game doesn't outstay its welcome. Another thing that helps is that the game's bloody lovely looking. I do reckon this might be a case where the SNES's muted colours really help capture Batman Returns' thoroughly wintry aesthetic, making for a purposefully dim, gothic and gloomy setting. It sounds fabulous as well. The soundtrack isn't necessarily the most memorable thing ever in terms of melodies and what have you, but it's full of action-packed riffs on the classic Danny Elfman score, and again, it absolutely fits what's going on in the game. There's even a little bit of impetus to carry on playing once you've finished a normal run, getting a message to try the harder difficulties if you really want to be considered a true Dark Knight. If there's only one complaint that people usually had about this game, well, it's the old one from SNES's Final Fight. It's single player only, with no chance for someone to play as Robin. Mind you, that would be quite silly, seeing as he's not even in the movie. Maybe they could have had a second player play as Alfred Pennyworth in a mechanised suit or something. In any case, the structure of Batman Returns does perhaps make multiplayer somewhat unfeasible, and regardless of that, it's still one of the best 16-bit beat-em-ups around, a tremendous title that, for what it is very hard to fault. If you were a Mega Drive owner back in the day, then honestly, this is one of those games that would have you a bit envious of your SNES sporting mates, especially when you compared it to the Batman Returns game that the MD got. The Mega Drive Batman Returns, unlike its SNES counterpart, is a thoroughly Western game, developed by Malibu Interactive, which is a bit weird. Malibu Interactive was formed after Acme Interactive, a short-lived studio that Bob Jacobs set up after the demise of Cinemaware, merged with the Malibu Graphics Publishing Group, a comic book publisher. You perhaps wouldn't expect the name of Malibu to be associated with Batman, but well, here we are. Malibu Interactive didn't make all that many games, most of them aren't particularly good, and this one, yeah, it's no exception to that, being a pretty generic side-scroller with several glaring and hideously annoying flaws that I'm all too eager to point out. An odd little thing here is that unlike most of the other games, the Mega Drive Batman Returns starts in the middle of the film. The intro scene sees Penguin murdering the Ice Princess and framing Batman for her death, before the rest of the game's 5 acts consist of locations such as the Cathedral, Max Schreck's store, the Red Triangle Circus, and naturally Penguin's hideout. So where do I start with this one? The Dark Knight is blessed with a few more tools in this title. Obviously he's got punches and kicks, and he can also glide and use his grappling hook, but his belt also contains a regular Batarang, smoke bombs, a bat swarm, the bat claw, and homing Batarangs, all of which are naturally in limited supply. This approach is a little similar to what the Bat had in the old Sunsoft NES game, and the weapons do occasionally have some use beyond the cheesing of bosses. Smoke bombs can be quite handy when it comes to stunning enemies, and the Batarang can actually deflect enemy bullets. With that said, the most powerful items are indeed probably best reserved for boss fights, where you're really going to need them, especially when you consider how detestably cheap this game is, which we'll get to in a minute. The problems with this one come thick and fast. Batman is, well, he's quite slow and ponderous. He does not exactly come across like the master of 1,001 different martial arts he's supposed to be. He's more like a slob who can do little except kick at short range and fire a grappling hook out of his crotch that occasionally decides to latch onto the ledge you're aiming at. Less Michael Keaton, more Victor Lewis Smith. And while Batman himself may be a slug, the Red Triangle goons certainly aren't. They're fast, come at you from all angles, and flip about all over the place, usually hitting you at least once. Even the weapons are somewhat hamstrung in this regard. You can only use them when you're on the ground and not when jumping, which is actually a total nuisance. As a result, this is the sort of typically crappy Western game where you end up always slowly inching forward in order to be as on guard as possible for an enemy spawning and coming at you like greased lightning. Oh, and by the way, this is one of those games that gives you an alert sound whenever you get low on energy. That's always such a great inclusion, and is never not incredibly friggin' annoying. The irritating enemies certainly contribute to the game's cheapness, but it's pretty well baked into most parts of the game. Some of the boss fights are especially annoying. The strongman in Act 2 who chucks debris from the entrance of Shrek's shop is awful, seeing as you only get a small window in order to outmaneuver him, get on his level, and then cheese him with your big guns. One of the very worst bits is the rolling ball at the end of the same act. You have to be damn near perfect with your movement to avoid getting crushed by it, particularly with how slow Bats is, and it's virtually guaranteed to kill you at least once. It's the sort of cheap bastardry where the devs almost know how awful they're being, so they give you a single extra life near the start of the descent, and you've still got to fight and defeat the penguin at the end in order to avoid doing it all over again. Constant stuff like this and the endless cheap hits from enemies makes the whole thing completely unfun. A hard game, but not hard in any way that's entertaining, just through being bitty at every single turn, and compounding that with a playable character who just feels slow, stiff, and ill-equipped. You do get unlimited continues, and you can even stick as many as 7 lives on the Caped Crusader. However, using a continue will start you at the very beginning of an act, and seeing as each act contains around 3 or 4 levels apiece, yeah, that's a pretty big step back, the sort that may well just make folks turn the bloody thing off if they get to the end of an act just to fall short at the finish. And I'm certainly not done with the complaints. Everything else about this game is thoroughly drab. Not in the way that the SNES game manages to capture the grim nature of the movie, just drab in the sense that levels are graphically uninspired and often appear to be thrown together. It commits another classic sin where you don't know what you can actually jump on and what's just background. It features most of the same enemies and boss characters from the movie that you would find in the SNES game, but nothing about them really stands out at all. And then you've got the music. Batman Returns uses the somewhat infamous Gems sound driver, which is usually blamed for a whole load of lousy tunes on the platform. It can produce good work in the right hands, such as Howard Drossin or Mark Miller, but this? Nah, especially not if you do something foolish like comparing it to the first MD Batman game soundtrack. Not all the music is bad, although the first level tune is a particular stinker, and that tends to be what people remember. It doesn't help that the music always seems to fluctuate in tempo either, and the sound effects are pretty grating throughout even if you don't include the frickin' low energy alarm. On the whole, yeah, I'm afraid this is a bit of a stinker. There's the odd moment where you think that there might have been a better game here, but it does end up being one of those classically disappointing Western Mega Drive platformers. Certainly not one of the worst games on the system, but something that I would put in the same class as, say, Chuck and the Forever Man or the original X-Men. Anything that's good here just gets swamped in thoroughly boring mediocrity and being cheap as all hell. Not in any way recommended. However, there is an argument to be made that the Mega Drive game isn't the main version of Batman Returns that Malibu Interactive were concentrating on. There is another one that's got a fair bit more worth to it. I am, of course, talking about the Mega CD version. This one came out a couple of months after the Mega Drive cartridge and does feature some very important additions that make it one of the absolute best of the upgraded Mega CD titles. Essentially what we have here is two games in one, the platforming game and the driving game, and you can either play these separately or interwoven, changing from driving to platforming. The platforming bit? Well, that's largely the same as what you would find on the Mega Drive without too many improvements, although the CD audio soundtrack and effects are a considerable step up, and it doesn't have a low energy alarm. It does have all the annoying cheap crap that you would find on cartridge, but you are certainly better off playing the platformer on Mega CD, simply thanks to the improved music alone. However, really, you should just forget about the platformer completely. The driving game, that's where it's at. Good grief, this is a better experience in every possible way. You cruise along in the Batmobile, or the Batski boat on the last two levels, and once again there's 5 acts that will feature multiple stages, and you need to clear a certain number of goons in bikes, cars, trucks and various other vehicles in each stage before the timer runs out. This is where the real benefits of the Mega CD hardware are shown. Forget about FMV, this is all about the improved hardware scaling, meaning that the game moves along at a ridiculous pace without ever compromising on the backgrounds, the level of sprites, or the amount of action that you get, and there's a killer soundtrack to boot. This is a really great technical showcase for the Mega CD, right alongside the excellent games that Core Design made for the hardware. It's pushing the add-on to its limits, and it might well be the most impressive example of hardware scaling that had been seen on a console up to this point. You've got undulating roads, big jumps, the lot, and all through this it never slows down. On top of that, well, more than just a technical showcase, it's just quite a fun game. It's very enjoyable and arcadey, allowing you to go full whack on the turbo and blast those red triangle bastards to Kingdom Come with your guns and missiles. Certainly a toughie in parts, with a timer that's always going to keep you on edge and some right tricky boss fights, but even if they're different genres, the difficulty here is everything that the original Mega Drive isn't, seeing as it's certainly hard, but always engaging. This is absolutely the sort of game that there really should have been more of on the Mega CD, as opposed to the FMV titles and what have you. Perhaps there would have been if the add-on had been more successful and there'd been more budget and resources devoted to it, but games like Batman Returns really do show off its true capabilities. Very good indeed, and definitely one of the best Batman Returns games. Perhaps not quite as good as the SNES beat 'em up, but not all that far off. You really should give this a go if you haven't. Let's move on then. We've had 16-bit Batman Returns, so now we should look at the 8-bit games. Once again, we've got a NES game that's a beat-em-up, and a Master System game that's a platformer. The 8-bit Batman Returns games aren't particularly well known at all. As you might expect, the NES game is a very late title indeed for the system, coming out between late 92 and 93 with no Japanese release, while the Master System title is a European exclusive, although there is a very similar game available in the USA for the Game Gear that we'll cover a bit later. Could we potentially be on the cusp of finding that oh-so-treasured thing in retro YouTube parlance? The fabled hidden gem? Well, let's have a look, kicking off with the NES title. The NES game is, much like the SNES one, a game by Konami, although it does play a fair bit differently. You don't get the Batarang only stages this time around, although you still get the Batmobile, albeit this time from a side-on perspective, and there's also room for a Batski boat stage. Batman can still use both Batarangs and a grappling hook and switch between them with the select button, but his other moves depend on what direction you're holding. He can block attacks using down and B, and he can perform a slide using down and A. If you aren't doing that, it's attack and jump, and the cape twirl is retained if you press both buttons together. Is this good? It can be a bit annoying in parts, especially if there's a bit where you've got to do some platforming. It can be a little too easy to throw a slide as opposed to jumping. Still, the controls are okay on the whole. The enemies are largely the same as they are in the SNES game, just scaled down a little. The slide can be pretty effective when it comes to closing the distance and getting a good drop on them, but I would say that on the whole this plays a bit tougher than the 16-bit. A big part of that is only getting 1 life per continue. You can gain extra health via pickups and also a bat box that essentially acts as an extra life if you get enough points, but continuing does take you back to the very start of the stage as opposed to the start of the level you're on. However, there is a password system in the NES title. On the whole, the game does feel, well, very Konami. The graphics are as typically good as you would expect from them, especially for such a late NES game, and the music is of their usual high standard. There are definitely some annoyances though. The enemies can be a little bit cheap, and this is one of those beat-em-ups where environmental challenges affect you, but don't affect the enemy. For instance, they can happily walk on electrified floors without getting hurt, or they can walk along the rooftops without gradually slipping off of them. This sort of thing isn't at all a deal breaker, but it does irk me a little bit. Where does this stand compared to other big NES beat-em-ups? It's certainly a curious one. Being that it came out so late, it's not one that a lot of people know. However, I would struggle to put it right up there with the very best. It kind of wears out its welcome a fair bit in a way that the SNES game certainly does not. I certainly think that Konami created better beat-em-ups with their second and third Turtles game on NES. It's hardly a bad game though, certainly a serviceable bit of brawling, and it still manages to capture the feel of the movie and the main scenes from it. The guys working on the game certainly weren't slouchers either. Following on from this title, designer Toshiki Yamamura and lead artist Tisaku Seki's next work would see them take the lead on no less a game than Castlevania Bloodlines. This wasn't Konami's final game on the NES, that wouldn't actually come until 1994 when they released an 8-bit version of TMNT Tournament Fighters, but Batman Returns does show that even at such a late stage, the company is still putting a good showing on the legendary 8-bit platform, even if it perhaps isn't amongst their very best NES works. Seeing as how the Master System Batman Returns is a European exclusive, I bet you're thinking that this is going to be a cut-down version of the 16-bit title that's probably also by Malibu. I mean, that was often the case after all. And while I wouldn't blame you for thinking that, you would be completely wrong. This is a totally different platformer, and it's not even by a Western developer. No, this is by Aspect, a Japanese studio with a strong Master System pedigree. This game has been planned by no less a figure than Katsuhiro Hasegawa, otherwise known as the Hase, a man responsible for plenty of great 8-bit games. He's on the likes of Deep Duck Trouble, the Game Gear and Master System Shinobi titles, Master System Ghouls and Ghosts, Axe Battler, and Legend of Illusion. Hiroshi Eso, who oversaw the Game Gear version, his credits include Rystar, Dragon Force, Knuckles Chaotix, and Tempo. The sound in this game? Motohiro Kawashima and Yuzo Koshiro. This is a pretty damn credible staff if ever there was one, all of whom are part of absolutely loads of great games. So how on earth has a game with such a collection of ruthless operators behind it fallen under the radar? Looking at it? Yeah, I really don't know why. If you like action platformers, particularly of the 8-bit variety, you should probably play this freaking game, right now. Because what we have here is an excellent example of one. If you want a game that's basically Batman meets Shinobi with a big slice of Bionic Commando for good measure, this might just be the game for you. You play as Brucey Baby through 5 levels. Each level has 3 parts, although there are actually 2 separate routes to the big final stage, which is Penguin's Lair, and you can switch routes between each level. Route 1 is probably best for your first time out, as the levels are considerably easier. Route 2 is definitely going to give even seasoned platform players a tough time in parts, and the last level is certainly not a picnic. The approach here is a little bit like that in the Game Gear Shinobi games, I think, at least when it comes to being able to pick your poison, although there are no big upgrades. Batman's toolkit is kind of simplified compared to other games. You just get a Batarang, which functions exactly like a boomerang and comes back to you. You can jump and glide, and you can use the hook. And you best get used to that grappling hook, because using it is going to get very intricate, pretty sharpish. The Caped Crusader can upgrade his movement speed, as well as the speed and power of his Batarang. However, he dies in one hit, and loses his Batarang upgrades on death. Generally speaking, death isn't a big punishment. You start back right from where you fell, and there's a lot of power-ups and even extra lives dotted around in containers, meaning it's easy to build up a surplus. The hefty use of the grappling hook is definitely where a bit of Bionic Commando comes into play, particularly the NES version, since you have to do a few really complex sequences with the hook in something of a similar vein to what you'd find in that game, especially in the Route 2 versions of some of the stages. Much like that game, it's very satisfying when you're actually able to nail a sequence without losing any lives, although it's most certainly going to take a bit of practice to do such a thing. I guess the reason why this game has gone so unheralded over the years is because people have just assumed that it's going to be similar to the 16-bit Mega Drive game. That was the case with a lot of European-only Master System titles, and while that wouldn't have necessarily been a bad thing, yeah, this ends up being a totally different beast, one where the Dark Knight really gets to strut his stuff. The graphics are perfectly fine for a Master System title, the music is as excellent as you would expect from a duo like Kawashima and Koshiro, and overall, it's a really fun 8-bit platformer. I would say in particular that if you really like the two Game Gear Shinobi games and you wish that there was a third game just like that, then this will very likely satisfy you. So is this a hidden gem? Oh, absolutely! Sound that hidden gem klaxon. Let Metal Jesus Rocks and company praise this one to the high heavens. This is one of the very best Batman Returns games. Hell, I would go as far as to say that it is second only to the SNES version, and it's really close between them. Discovering a game this good is one of the joys about making a video like this one, and you should absolutely give this one a go, immediately. Seeing as we do have a couple of handheld games to look at, it makes sense to do the Game Gear title next. It is very similar to the Master System game and actually came out first, although there are differences. One difference of course is that the Game Gear Batman Returns only came out in North America, while the Master System version only came out in Europe. But there are other differences when it comes to the actual games. The levels are changed here to be a bit more like a side-scrolling beat-em-up, with much less in the way of platforming. I think that, on the whole, this makes the game a bit easier than the Master System title, although it's a shame that there's less emphasis on swinging around with the grappling hook. The game's system also changes a fair bit. Batman now has an energy bar as opposed to dying in one hit, although losing that bar now starts you back at the beginning of a stage. There's no upgrades this time. Batman can now change the range and strength of his Batarang through the pause menu, although I personally just tend to stick with the short range and high power option. You also get a special which allows the Batmobile to come in and fire some missiles at your enemies, Streets of Rage style, and there is the addition of a couple of cutscenes. The graphics and the music are largely the same and still very good, with Batman himself being a bit bigger here on the GG and there being a few more special effects in some bits. But while this game is still very decent indeed, my preference would definitely be the Master System version, due to that one having a lot more platforming. But again, this is still a really good game that's worthy of the Caped Crusader's name. An excellent 8-bit effort all around on the Sega platforms. Sticking with handhelds, we come to one of the Batman Returns titles that was undoubtedly marketed and pushed the most. Indeed, it's the one that came out first. Batman Returns on the Atari Lynx beat every other game of the movie to the market, coming out as early as June 1992, just in time for the film's premiere, and Atari was certainly eager to push it with TV advertising and so on, even including it as a pack-in title for the second version of the Lynx in some regions. Headed up by the late John Scrutch, an Atari veteran who worked on various Lynx and Jaguar titles including Checkered Flag, Rampart and Cybermorph, the programming was done by the duo of Centipede Millipede God tier player Eric Ginner and Jerome Strutch, who'd eventually go on to work for Pixar. An early interview with Scrutch for Atari's official Explorer Online magazine in 1992 reveals that the Lynx version of Rygar was the team's main inspiration for gameplay, and even comments somewhat on the rather short time that they had to make the game. Production didn't even really start in earnest until November of 1991, and the pretty hefty crunch that was involved in getting this game ready on time for the movie's cinematic release on June 19th. And so, well, what's the end result of all of this? Yeah, I really don't like this game. I do have a couple of positive notes. There are nice big graphics and nice big sprites. It's a bit more cartoony than the other Batman Returns titles we've seen, but I don't necessarily mind that. Everything else about this, though, is infuriating. The music is quite grating, and there isn't exactly a lot of it, meaning that it gets on your nerves very quickly. The game itself is a typical side-scroller with 4 pretty large levels. That doesn't seem like much, but oh boy, this game is brutal. It swamps you with enemies right from the get-go, usually ones that will throw explosives right in your face and knock poor bats around like a pinball. The first level alone, which I admittedly cannot get past, is an absolute murderer's row of dynamite and bomb-chucking clowns, knife throwers, organ grinders, and even a part where you'll instantly die if you don't happen to be behind a mailbox when Max Shrek's store blows up. Oh, and you fight the duck vehicle at the end. He moves like Carl Lewis, and you only hurt him if you can hit his tiny little eye. Good luck. And did I mention that you only get 1 life, 1 energy bar, and that's your lot? You can get refills, but there are no continues, my friend. This game may look like it's short if you just look at a long play on YouTube, but, well, good luck, sucker. Even limited supplies of Batarans and test tubes aren't going to help you all that much. I bravely save-scummed this first level on an emulator as much as I could, but alas, it didn't really help me out much. It is savage, and certainly not in a way that's fun. It assaults you to the point where really, you're best off just running through stages as fast as you can, trying to avoid contact with the enemy, because facing up to them is usually going to result in at least a couple of hits on you, if not worse, and you can ill afford that. Running away is not exactly what I want from a game based around Batman, I have to say. So yeah, this really isn't a good one. Reviews of the title from the time period said much the same thing. It's not a bad looker, but the difficulty is completely out of whack. Perhaps if it had a bit more time, they could have made a fuller game here. I can almost see why the game only gives you 1 life, seeing as it is only around 15 to 20 minutes long on a full playthrough. But I guess they didn't have a great deal of time to do any more if they only had a few months to make the game, and a significant chunk of that time would have been spent getting approval from Warner and so on for what they were making. In the end, it turns out that making sure a game comes out for the film's premiere maybe isn't always the best approach. Still, the Lynx is hardly the worst Batman Returns handheld experience. There is, after all, a Tiger Electronics game to consider. Oh yes, there most assuredly is. Unfortunately, while you can play a bunch of Tiger handhelds in MAME, this one has yet to be dumped or made playable, but there are adverts that proclaim the title to be Tiger's hottest handheld to date and are classically cheesy, with some annoying kid pretending to enjoy themselves and be utterly wowed by what they're seeing. From what's there, it appears to be some game where you ride around in the Batmobile, and considering the general standard of Tiger's titles, I can pretty safely say that this LCD game is worse than the Lynx one. That's kind of a no-brainer. Still, it is another version of Batman Returns, and so I thought I should mention it.
Face the Penguin in 5 levels of skill.
You don't really think you'll win, do you?
The Batman Returns handheld electronic game, now playing in a pocket near you.
One curious thing, mind you. We've got Batman Returns on most every other platform, with the exception of the arcade, but there is another major one that's missing. There's no Game Boy Batman Returns title, which is a bit surprising considering how popular said handheld was. There doesn't appear to have been any plans for a Batman Returns game, although one presumes that the idea must have been floated. Without any concrete information, we can hazard a guess at why there wasn't one through referring to the big timeline of Bat-related games. Sunsoft's Game Boy version of their second Bat game, Return of the Joker, didn't come out until around the second quarter of 1992, fairly close to the upcoming movie, even if it is obviously different. You would probably expect though that if there had been a Game Boy game, it'd have been made by Konami, same as the other Nintendo titles. However, they instead worked on a Game Boy only game based on Batman the Animated Series, which, let's not forget, made its TV debut a couple of months after the release of Returns in cinemas. This game came out in late 1993, and so while I suppose there would have been a short window in which a Returns game could have come out for the GB, perhaps the bosses at Konami were worried that, between that, the earlier Sunsoft game, and this upcoming title, the result might have been a significant case of overbatuation. Kill me sometimes with this banter, I really do. So that there's something else here aside from a hideous pun, I suppose it's worth having a quick look at the animated series game. It's the closest thing to something that represents the Game Boy here. I'm not fully sure when else I would get a chance to look at it, and I only have the 2 computer games left. So it's worth a look. After all, maybe there's a possibility that it was originally a Returns game that got switched to TAS in the middle of development. It's a platformer. Shocking, I know, split into 5 episodes, each starring someone else from the Rogues Gallery. Joker wants to send explosive bears to everyone in Gotham, Poison Ivy kidnaps Harvey Dent, pre-Two-Face, and wants to recreate Day of the Triffids on a citywide scale, Mr. Freeze and Scarecrow get together to put the willies up everybody, and so on. All very nice and super villainous, and told with the help of cutscenes. The platformer itself is decent. Bat's mainly punches and has a few batarans, and while he can only throw his hooks straight up, he can also wall jump, just like in the Sunsoft NES game. We've got some nice bits of sprite work here and there, although there's not too much in the way of music, which is a bit of a shame for a Konami title. There are also parts where you get to play as Robin. Robin is fairly similar to Batman. He has a bit less health, but he can use his acrobatics to hang onto ceilings and travel that way. This is the only title to come out under the animated series name. Other titles on the 16-bits came out after the name of the show had been changed to The Adventures of Batman and Robin. I wouldn't say this is on the level of those games, which are quite excellent after all, but it's a fine handheld platformer, and a decent enough challenge. Certainly worth a little look. Okay, 2 titles left, and things are about to get even more diverse. Our last 2 games came out on the computers, one for PC and one for Amiga. Are you ready for a Batman point-and-click adventure? And are you ready for a tale of absolute scumbag behaviour where fans of one computer thought they were getting a certain game and ended up with something completely different and far, far worse? Believe it or not, we've yet to see the worst game to come out under the Batman Returns name, but it's definitely coming. First off, however, we do have a bit of an adventure to look at. The PC Batman Returns game, originally released in December 1992, is a thoroughly different beast from all the others, being a point-and-click by Park Place under their Spirit of Discovery imprint, and distributed by Konami. The actual developers, though, were Subway Software, a studio belonging to the late William Bill Kunkel. Kunkel is a bit of an unsung hero, a lover and writer of comic books, a pro wrestling fan and journalist, and one of the first ever working video game journalists, starting out with a column called Arcade Alley in the late 70s, and moving towards a whole magazine, Electronic Games, from 1981, founded with friends and regular collaborators Arnie Katz and Joyce Worley. This same trio would start Subway Software in 1985, working on a selection of intriguing titles, including Micro League Wrestling, one of the first ever wrestling games, and Batman Returns is their final game. A huge Batman fan, details of how Kunkel snagged the job were available on his old column for Digital Press. When he heard that Konami was shopping for developers for Batman Returns based games and that Park Place had landed a contract with them, he used his connections at Park Place to get an opportunity to pitch an idea and landed a deal thanks to his adventure game experience. However, this didn't necessarily become the dream project Kunkel hoped for, as we'll soon go into. The game itself, I would say it's pretty okay, although this comes with a caveat that point and clicks really aren't my strong suit. It's different from the norm you may expect from LucasArts or Sierra games. There's actually no inventory puzzles at all. Now, this makes sense, really. Why on earth would a multimillionaire who can build gadgets to deal with absolutely anything need to tie a rake and hoe together with a shirt? The main focus of the game, especially for the first few days, is in compiling evidence, moving around the various locations, taking said evidence back to the Bat computer to view and extrapolate info from them, often having to be aware of the time and place that certain events are happening. Derailing Oswald Cobblepot's plan to become mayor is naturally the main focus, and if you've ever seen the flick, you'll know that in order to do so, you need to reveal his true nature to the public and find his plans to incriminate the mayor. The path to doing so leads through various other tasks, finding his HQ, combing through old Gotham Zoo, repeated visits to a fish market, and the odd bit of fighting with the man himself and his Red Triangle goons. These fights are cinematic in nature, mainly just happening until you use the right tool in your utility belt to take care of the enemy, with the chance to interrogate some of them after using your Bolo Batarang. Doing this is pretty important. Considering some of the attempts at action I've seen in point-and-click games, making these fights puzzles of a sort is a decent solution. The game is lovely looking, nice animation, nice recreations of the movie's settings, and a fine recreation of the classic Danny Elfman's score. However, there are certainly some issues. The whole process of moving from location to location to make sure you don't miss any bits of evidence can be a little repetitive, especially as there aren't all that many of them. One of the game's biggest flaws though is how it translates the movie to the screen. I think that'd be a bit of a disappointment for some. A lot of events and even characters from the movie basically just get crammed into the final day. Even Catwoman, who I think most would agree is a pretty bloody important part of the film, doesn't appear until you are virtually at the finish. The last bit of the game does become a bit of a mess, kind of shoehorning all of these things that happen in the movie right at the end, from the Ice Princess getting kidnapped, to duck vehicles and Selena Kyle to missile-toting Emperor Penguins, while most of the rest of the game is a fairly engrossing slow burner that, for a change, focuses on the detective side of Batman as opposed to the punchy face side that features in 90% of other Bat games. There's various other nice extras to add colour, getting those Gotham news reports, the option to eject from the Batmobile, which is fun to do at least once, even if it's an instant game over, and a database full of Gotham's various important people. That includes this funny little Easter egg, something that's purely for the wrestling fans. One of Gotham's known criminals is apparently Wade Barbecue Keller, who you may know as the writer of the Pro Wrestling Torch newsletter. Apparently he used to work for crooked landlords and will now hire himself out to anyone with enough money, and he likes to watch every one of his fires. I don't know, I get the impression from this that Kunkel didn't like Wade Keller all that much, for reasons that I don't know. Going back to the disconnect between this game and the movie, there is a bit of reasoning for this awkwardness. Bill Kunkel did not like the script for Batman Returns at all, saying that he openly wept after he finished reading the draft he'd been given. He wanted the game to be more of a celebration of Batman that would really get into that detective side of his character, perhaps more in line with the old comics, but sticking in events from the movie kinda got in the way, and the development became something of a running battle between Kunkel and Warner Brothers, who were mandating the inclusion of all these various things from the movie, and the whole experience was enough for Kunkel to stop making video games entirely. That's a shame, and while I suppose you can't blame Warner for wanting the movie to be a part of this game of the movie, it's definitely a two sides to every story type thing, and the discord perhaps explains why so many of the movie's plot points only really happen in the last part, while others kinda, well, they just don't. Batman never gets framed for the Ice Princess's murder, in fact she doesn't even get murdered as far as I know, and really there's very little if any interaction with anyone like Max Schreck or Mayor Jenkins, or anyone at all. Even Alfred barely appears. It's a pretty lonely life for Bruce Wayne, I'm afraid, even more so than usual. In fact, if this was the only experience you ever had of Batman, you would think that the Dark Knight's only friend in the world was a cigar-chomping fishmonger named Tony. As odd as this game might be, as an adventure and Bat title, I do think it is a curious one that's worth playing. It's not a famous point and click, nor do I believe that it's a well-liked one amongst the connoisseurs, but it does make for a change of pace from most other Batman games. Finally, oh boy, it's time for the Amiga game. I have not been looking forward to this one at all, as it's something of a grim old story about the troubles of microcomputer development, particularly when it comes to studios with great names that were really starting to struggle during the 16-bit era. There's also a part where one magazine previewed an entirely different game to the one that Amiga folks ended up getting. So yeah, this is going to be the worst of the Batman Returns games. It's another side-scroller, but a really bloody shoddy one. However, as always, there is a little bit more to this game's story that's worth talking about. This version of Batman Returns was made by the Liverpool-based studio Denton Designs, or Dentons as they were known by this stage. It was contracted by Konami, but published through GameTech, the North American computer studio that Konami had close relations with. Initially, the game was going to be published not just for the Amiga, but for the Atari ST and even the Commodore 64. The C64 version was initially previewed in the August 1993 issue of Commodore Force. Now I think we can all agree that is really bloody late for a C64 game. As is often the case, Games That Weren't has a lot of documentation for this unfinished title. The magazine, formerly known as Zap64, leaped on to documenting the process, publishing a monthly diary for the game written by Roy Bannon, the project's lead. The game's creation wasn't going badly, and the two main diary entries detailed the process of largely completing the first two levels while getting assets ready for the other three. However, the third diary entry, from October's issue, largely binned any talk of the game's development, and instead detailed Roy's recent trip to nearby New Brighton. In other words, something's gone very wrong. Sure enough, Konami had decided that in the end, releasing a Batman Returns game on the C64 in late 1993 wasn't really worth the bother, and they cancelled it. Those at Denton's who worked on the title, from Roy Bannon to Paul Salmon and studio head and lead artist Ali Noble, were disappointed but perhaps not too surprised at Konami's decision. The Atari ST version of the game, which was previewed in the June 1993 issue of ST Action, was probably also cancelled around this time. By this stage in 1993, unfortunately, there wasn't much of a games market left on that system either. Currently, nothing exists of these games beyond screenshots. It's known that demos of the games were sent to Konami, but none of the people involved in the creation of these versions have been able to find them. In the end, the Amiga version is the only one to come out. Judging by the info available on the two unreleased versions, they were both a lot further along than the Amiga one was at the time of cancellation, but Konami judged that the Amiga release was the only one that could conceivably make any money. And so Denton's, disappointed already by the loss of two versions that could have potentially injected some much needed revenue, had to go into full crunch mode to try and get something out by the end of 1993. The Amiga game was also previewed a fair bit in various mags, looking similar to the other versions we've seen, although Amiga Action hardly helped matters when, in October 93, they ran a 2-page preview for a version of the PC point-and-click game. Someone clearly hugely screwed up, whether it was at GameTech or at the magazine or wherever. As far as anyone knows, there was never any plans or any work ever done on converting Subway's point and click to the Amiga. Therefore, if you were a regular reader of Amiga action back in the day, and I am dearly sorry if that was the case, you may well have been even more disappointed by the game that finally came out for the Amiga very late on in 1993, perhaps even early 1994. Either way, it is easily the last of the Batman Returns games to be released, coming out months after any of the others. This game largely plays like a side-scrolling beat-em-up, where you have to deal with the various goons, usually red triangle folk but occasionally cops and penguins, before moving on to the next section. The general horror of this game lies in how stiff and useless the Dark Knight is. One look at his kicking is enough to make your heart sink, and every enemy seems to take a whole load of hits. And that's if you can hit them, because the collision detection is seriously balked in some parts to the point of comedy. This is largely the formula for the first 2 levels, and then the third, where you spend most of your time battling against Catwoman on Gotham's rooftops, introduces a lot more platforming. And that's where things get even worse. This isn't even just about using up to jump. The jump itself is so delayed, unpredictable and uncontrollable that it's comically difficult to do anything with it. Even the simplest of leaps became a frustrating nightmare. And yeah, if I'm honest, I really couldn't go much further. I had infinite lives on because frankly you'll need them to get anywhere at all with this, but it's one of the poorest attempts at a side-scroller that I've covered in a long time. The scant amount of good things I can say is that some of the music isn't too bad, and the game moves fast, but for an Amiga title from the end of '93, that's not much to say, and it certainly doesn't make up for the completely broken gameplay. The graphics also, yeah, definitely the weakest of any Batman game we've seen. The contemporary reviews for the game were similarly scathing. The highest it could muster was a 55% from German mag Amiga Joker. CU Amiga said that it would be easier for them to pull a double-decker bus out of their bottoms than recommend the game. Simon Byron of The One said that Batman looked more like Gitman and compared it unfavourably to Fatman the Caped Consumer of all games, while Stuart Campbell of Amiga Power said that your kid sister's My Little Pony could write a better Batman game with a badly bugged version of the shoot-'em-up construction kit. A common theme in these reviews is disappointment at the name of Denton being associated with it. A great studio in the 8-bit days, responsible for the likes of Frankie Goes to Hollywood, The Great Escape, Where Time Stood Still, and many others. But alas, time wasn't always kind to the great names from the 80s. Dentons were not in a good spot by this stage, and sadly Batman Returns would be one of their last games. GameTech, the publishers, pretty much sent it out to die. It was released as a budget title, and presumably not in any great quantity, so it's highly doubtful it made much in the way of money. In the end, it would have probably been better if this Amiga version had met the same fate as the Atari and C64 ones. A truly woeful and saddening affair. And with that, we're done with all of the Batman Returns games. And what an interesting journey it's been. There are surely a few movies out there that have more tie-in games associated with it, Star Wars for an obvious example, but we have quite a diverse range of titles here, including some well-known excellent ones and others that deserve way more recognition. Even the lesser titles at least have interesting stories related to them, and it's been a lot of fun to play and research all of these different takes on this particular Bat sequel. Hopefully you've also enjoyed watching it, but for now, well, join me next time. Same Kim time, same Kim channel, and all of that. Bye for now. There is perhaps no stranger sort of licensed game than the one based on the soap opera. Not necessarily because of the soap opera genre itself, but, well, just look at the games that have come out based on them. the utterly incomprehensible and dreadfully Stenders game where you do things like rock giant babies to sleep and transform yourself into a laundry basket, the Neighbours title that's inexplicably a karting game where you ride around Ramsey Street, or the Dallas-based text adventure where you mostly go through a jungle, feed tobacco to a monkey, and J.R. Ewing's disguised as one of the tribesmen. They're all damn strange, and this one, well, it's no exception. I played this on stream a couple of weeks ago, and I feel so aggrieved and insulted by it that, well, I just had to make a video. Coronation Street, The Mystery of the Missing Hot Pot Recipe, a PC game from 2011. A bit more modern than the usual fare one here perhaps, but certainly more than worthy of scorn. Now forgive me if I dispense with the usual litany of research and whatnot for this. There's not exactly a lot to say, but if you want pure invective, well, you've come to the right place. This game was actually gifted to me as a birthday present a month ago by one of my Twitch regulars. The same regular also gifted me a copy of the Ken Russell film Listomania, regularly eats cream of chicken soup mixed with cornflakes, and also often dresses like Liz, just so you get a bit of colour. This game has scourged the streams of a couple of other good people I know, folks like Octavius and Nicky and Bunty, who have also ended up with copies of the game. And yes, thanks to this man. If you see him around, do not approach, you may end up with a copy of the game yourself. Mystery of the Missing Hot Pot Recipe is the only computer game to ever come out for good old Coronation Street, the UK's and indeed the world's oldest TV soap opera, an institution since 1960. You know, like Onewell or Bethlehem. What better way to celebrate 50 glorious years in the company of the denizens of Weatherfield than with a game? Perhaps it could celebrate the show's lengthy history and really be something for the dedicated followers of it. Or, you know, it could be a hideous missing objects game that's likely to drive even the most stoic of people to total oblivion. I think you can guess where this falls into already. The game deals with Betty Williams telling the story of how the residents of Weatherfield recovered one of the most important items in the history of the great town, the recipe for her legendary Lancashire hot pot, the reason why people from far and wide flock to the Rover's Return Inn. Betty, in her infinite wisdom, has torn up the recipe because she heard that rival pub, the Weatherfield Arms, wanted to get their hands on it. But then, a crisis! A gust of wind scattered the pieces of the recipe all over the shop, and the garage, and the taxi firm, not to mention various people's houses. Anyone who finds a bit of the recipe will get a pint of best on the house, so naturally it's action stations for the town's residents as they try and find this most revered of items. No one's totally sure just what makes Betty's saucepan of lamb, onion and potatoes quite so special, and anyone who's tried to find out in the past has probably ended up disappearing, with people commenting that Betty's signature dish was particularly filling that week. But now, all that's dispensed with in the service of recovering this document. You may expect that this tale would be told through specially written and shot scenes and the like featuring the soap stars. And you would obviously be wrong. It's told through static images. JPEGs and PNGs are the order of the day, with various minimal sound effect loops that repeat endlessly. The stakes are not exactly high to begin with, in all honesty, but the utter bareness on display here really drives that home. You'd find more motivation to do something by firing up art alive. The gameplay is, as mentioned, all about finding hidden objects, which you do so in various places. Starting of course with the Rover's Return. You have a list of various items, you find them all, and then you have to find a piece of the recipe. Well, some of the time anyway. Other times you may just be told to move on and go to another vignette of Weatherfield life. Perhaps Sean Tully's got to hunt for needles in the Underworld factory, or Audrey Roberts needs someone to find and organise all the bottles of peroxide in the hairdressers, or Roy Cropper's in a terrible fit because he's accidentally served up the cat from the title sequence in one of his roles and he needs to find and dispose of the evidence. Okay, maybe not the last one. The overriding theme of these vignettes, some of which we will explore a little further, is that nobody in Weatherfield ever friggin' tidies up after themselves. As far as the play goes, well, it's missing objects. I have very little experience with this type of game, and I'm not about to go and do a deep dive into the genre anytime soon, but the objects you need to find are scattered around at random. From what I can tell, the objects you need to find are randomised for each scene. This is a type of game that very quickly becomes infuriating, indeed almost from the first level. The temptation would be to apply some kind of logic here. For example, perhaps you need to find a beer mat. Well, I should obviously look to see if there's any on the tables, shouldn't I? Or perhaps they'll be on the bar. No, that's probably not going to be the case. There's just as much chance of you finding a beer mat on top of a typewriter, or by the side of a door frame, or shoved up Steve McDonald's arse. The items could be anywhere. And they are, indeed, very well hidden. A lot of them are ghosted out, virtually invisible, only traceable by the faintest outline. You'll be doing this even in the first level. So no, do not apply logic to this game, for that way lies madness. If you find that Ashley the Butcher's got the outline of a sausage impaled in his chest, just try not to question it. Don't even question why there's a load of sausages randomly scattered around a butcher's at all. If you start to wonder why health and safety haven't closed this festering bed of war meat and bric-a-brac down, you'll just go ballistic. It's a challenge, but to play this effectively you essentially need to become a complete and total idiot. Now some may find this easier to do than others, of course, but it is a key part to this exercise. As you go through these scenes, your eyes will surely soon start to glaze over, disoriented at the sheer amount of completely random objects that have been chucked all over the screen, with the well-meaning yet barbaric aim of finding the ones you need at your leisure, opaque or not. Randomly fumbling, thrashing and clicking about isn't exactly encouraged. If you start to do this, the mouse cursor will spin around for a bit to stop you. There are a couple of mercies. You can use hints if you're stuck, and they're unlimited, simply making you wait a minute or so before using it again. If you physically cannot play the game for another second without spitting all over the screen, and rest assured this will happen, then you can always turn it off and the game will save your progress, even if you're in the middle of a scene, allowing you to sufficiently calm down enough to brave the joys of the garage, or street cabs, or the corner shop once more. There are some other little mini-games that crop up every now and again, although these aren't exactly any more complex. You may have to sort out the pipes in the Rover's cellar, or figure out a save combination, or help order Ken Barlow's books, or help Craig Charles play what is quite possibly the most hilarious and broken take on Breakout that the world of gaming has ever seen. As it happens, these segments are optional. If you fancy your chances at speedrunning the game, you'll probably want to skip them. Now you might think that to be another pithy remark, but I'm not joking. There are actually people who speedrun this. The current world record on speedrun.com is 11 minutes and 19 seconds, held by someone named Infarth who surely has quite the strong constitution. I can only tip my hat at being able to withstand this long enough not just to complete this, but to become the world's best player of it. We are capable of so much, dear viewer, if only we focus our minds fully on a task. Still, there is the story, isn't there? All the characters that you may possibly know and love, or at least the ones you may remember if you've ever been stuck downstairs while the parents insist on watching bloody Corrie while you're having dinner. I mean, they have at least had their personalities captured, haven't they? Well, not exactly. It is hard to overstate just how thoroughly unasked this title is. It feels like it was made by simply going to the show's official website, downloading all the generic pictures of the various locations and portraits of the characters, and then just chucking them around, loosely holding them together with a basic and often badly written script. It is quite amazing to think that there's 24 years between this and the EastEnders ZX Spectrum game, and with all the time that had passed and all the technological advances that there have been, the developers managed to create something that is almost just as illogical, weird, and flat out dim when it comes to the show itself. And this is a soap opera we're talking about here, not Breaking Bloody Bad. It's a silly place where unconvincing PNGs are superimposed onto a static background, barely any different from the random bits of junk that you have to click on. Nothing belongs. Not even Ken Barlow. He is here, of course, as with everything Coronation Street, the one constant of the show ever since the very first episode was aired on December 9th, 1960. An entire life lived as a character, in front of the cameras. It doesn't get any more Corrie than old Ken. and I think he might have his own little comment when it comes to the amount of effort that was put into this title, actually.
Well, I'm sorry, Deirdre, but this time that's not enough!
It bears repeating, but what is truly something, again, is just how little in the way of stakes there are, and not just because of the story and it being about a quest for a bloody hot pot recipe. The gameplay itself does really hammer it home. Again, I'm no expert, but I would expect that a hidden objects game would feature things like a time limit, or a set amount of clicks, or a limit on the amount of hints you can use, and so on. This doesn't have any of that. You can take as much time and click around as much as you like, and the only thing that happens is the pointer spinning around a bit every now and again. It is casual to a quite ridiculous extreme. The only thing that's actually going to stop you from finishing the game is if you can stand it long enough to do that and not uninstall it and lob the disc directly into the bin. And it's not exactly short either. There are 24 levels of this, all with nothing but a very repetitive effects loop accompanying them. By the time you get to the end, the whistling of that kettle is going to sound like a primal scream. And of course you do get bits of story in between, every one of which is to do with tidying up. Clean up Roy's rolls while the indomitable Cropper sorts out your Eccles cakes, clean up the perpetual mess that's left behind at the Grimshaws, clean the inexplicable detritus in Dev's corner shop, pick up the bloody spanners and wrenches in the garage whether they're invisible or not. So much cleaning! By the end you'll feel like Kim Woodburn on steroids, and you'll probably want to down a pint of straight gin too. And just what happens in the end? Well, you find all the pieces, you put them back together, and the recipe is saved. So what does Betty do then? She makes sure no one else can ever have the recipe by burning it. The whole town's gone haywire looking for all these recipe pieces. It's been such a Herculean effort on the part of everybody. They've done it all, and then Betty goes ahead and incinerates it. It's not like the sodding Weatherfield Arms were going to find them anyway, was it? These pieces couldn't have been more out of the way if they'd actually been placed there. All of this, in conclusion, meant absolutely nothing. In the actual Corrie, the character of Betty Williams was written off the show only a few months after the release of the game, following the real-life passing of her actor, Betty Driver, at the age of 91 due to natural causes. The character passed off screen, peacefully in her sleep. If the events of this game had in any way been canon, the street's residents would have likely burned her alive in a giant wicker hot pot. I suppose, after all this, the big question is simply, why? I think that's the first thought that comes to anyone's mind when they come across this game, and it will be their final thought when they've had enough of playing the damn thing. Why does this exist? It is quite funny to note that this particular hot pot itself is oddly famous enough to maybe justify it. It is indeed a big part of the soap opera's lore. Hell, ready-made and very real versions of the hot pot have even been put on sale, thanks to the co-op and legendary northern pie makers Hollands. It even nearly killed one character in the soap. They had a heart attack just after eating one. It was that good. So you can't exactly say that this particular dish isn't well known. I don't know, maybe you'll see Binging with Babish fix this up on a video one day, although he'd probably have to be pretty bloody desperate to do so. I suppose in the end this does have a unique place in gaming history. There are many licensed games, and there are many licensed games based on TV shows, including a few soap operas. But I can't think of too many other licensed games that are directly based on a famous item of food from a show. In this regard, the mystery of the missing hot pot recipe is surely unique. And it doesn't in any way make the game any less absolutely bloody diabolical. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until next time, bye for now. We're all somewhat familiar with promotional games and advert games, aren't we? There's certainly a few pretty famous ones kicking around for big brands. All the McDonald's related games, for example, or Cool Spot. Amiga platforms like Zool, James Pond 2 and Superfrog that so happen to respectively advertise Chupa Chups, Penguin Bars and Lucasade. There's even some very silly old ones that are pretty well known, like Chase the Chuckwagon for the Atari 2600, a game made by Purina to advertise dog food, and Pepsi Invaders Coke Wins for the same platform, a game distributed internally at Coca-Cola HQ as some sort of rah-rah piece. These sorts of games have always interested me as an aficionado of the classic licensed game. But as it turns out, well, there's a lot more ones out there than just what the people know. For this video centred around promotional and advert games, I'm taking the roads less travelled. We're ignoring consoles completely and looking at old computers. In doing so, we find a lot of interesting things. We've got games for brands you might not expect to see featuring such things at all, more games that were purely designed to be distributed inside of companies and never reached a commercial shelf, games with a very strong political and civic message, and even a game that advertises cigarettes. And shockingly, not all of these obscurities are terrible. Most are, but a couple of these are decent. So, get a load of these games that you may well not know. Perhaps we should start with the cigarette game first. Now you might wonder if I'm pulling some sort of bait and switch here. This could just be some sports game that takes the name of a world championship tournament, for example, back in the days when cigarette branding was all over sports. But no, this isn't Rothman's football quiz on the Spectrum. This is a game where cigs are front and centre, live and in your face, and of all genres, it's a point and click adventure game, one that a big company was involved with. I give you Sunny Shine on the Funny Side of Life, released commercially in 1990 for the Atari ST, Amiga and C64 in Germany only. The plot has you play as a 30-something ad exec named Sunny Shine who, whilst buying a pack of his favoured L&M cigarettes, for they were the ones who commissioned this thing, had his car accidentally steamrolled. It's your job to find another car for our chain-smoking friend, or whilst talking to various other people who may well help you. I suppose that is if you give them a cigarette or a light or whatever. Most everyone in this game smokes, and you can find some sort of advertisement from L&M in just about every screen of the game. To be honest, I can't say too much about it, seeing as it's all in German, but most people say that this whole thing comes off as a poor man's LucasArts game, similar most of all to Zack McCracken. Quite a surprising amount of effort went into the thing, and it was actually available to buy on shop shelves, but no, it's not very good. It is weird though, especially in 2020, to think that once ago there was a game like this that advertised cigarettes. It's baffling. And to think that so much effort went into it. Rainbow Arts were the folks who apparently developed this thing. But Sunny Shine wasn't the only game advertising cancer sticks out there. Others were created, although most of them were only distributed internally and unfortunately they're still missing in action. We know of a game called Come Together, which was commissioned by Peter Stuyvesant, the Light American Space Game for Philip Morris, and R1R2 for Riensma. All three of these were made by Ego Software, who you may remember from the last video about Amiga Euro platformers as creators of Ugh, and later makers of the X Space games. Their founder, Bernd Lehan, said that back then he didn't think too much about creating these ad games or who they were for. It was just a living, pretty much. Just a job to do. Hey-ho. So as we all know, if you smoke too many cigarettes, well, you may get sick. And you may end up needing some pharmaceuticals. Well, not to worry. Glaxo Wellcome have got you covered. They've got you covered so much, in fact, that in 1992 they had a game made featuring a hero by the name of George Glaxo. Well, I guess he's a hero anyway. Much like Captain Novolin, he is a hero stricken by a health condition, in his case, asthma. George makes his way through various levels, and he has to take the correct medicine in order to stop himself from getting short of breath. However, various animals will try and thwart his progress. Some can actually hurt poor George, but others just indirectly hurt him by causing him to get asthmatic. Like this cute fluffy dog right here. He's gorgeous, but he's also a hazard. Maybe you can avoid him. Well, sometimes. But other times, well, you just got no choice other than to shoot him to death. Yes, this promotional game, made for big pharmaceutical company Glaxo, features you shooting cute puppies and other animals minding their own business to death, simply because they give you asthma. Some hero, huh? I mean, I'm sure that this sadistic boy here isn't representative of all asthmatics, but that's one freaky message, isn't it? This is kind of where we're at with these strange games. So, seeing as how we're trying to awkwardly link these games together, I'll say that if, like George Glaxo, you go around shooting cute animals to death, you may well fall foul of outfits like Greenpeace. And yes, Greenpeace had a game that was commercially released during the time when they seemed to be making a fair bit more publicity for themselves. Presenting to you Rainbow Warrior, published by Microstyle in 1989 and even named after their flagship that was bombed en route to a nuclear protest a few years prior to this. Now I can already see the comments making politically laced jokes. Ha ha, they say. This must be Greta Thunberg's favourite game. Ha ha. Now I'm not necessarily above making such jokes, but I would say instead that if Greta so happened to play this game, it may well be the reason why she always seems to have such a sour expression. Why? Well, because it's atrocious. It's the worst environmental-centric game I have ever played. And yeah, that makes it worse than Awesome Possum. Rainbow Warrior consists of several dreadfully made and often unintentionally hilarious minigames, the majority of which are basically unplayable. I really have no idea what's going on in the section where you play as a dolphin and have to block pipes, nor did I know that Greenpeace had dolphins actively working for them. You have other things like boarding a waste ship that's dumping crap in the water and manning their cranes, which again just looks quite amusing. It looks like you get on top and you're just like, yeah! It's like you're having a rave or whatever. Perhaps the silliest ones involve trying to shoot down flying aerosol cans that are spraying holes in the ozone layer, or the platform level where you have to save seals from being clubbed. Aside from it being uncontrollable, the sight of these enemies frantically running around and just whacking seals is... I can't lie, it's hilarious. I guess not least because for me, and I presume others of a certain age, the idea of baby seals being clubbed is inextricably linked to the television antics of Tom Green. You know, MC face, slaughter your water, all of that. Anyway, yeah, this game is bloody awful. There's nothing whatsoever to do with the environmental message, of course, it's just unplayable, ridiculously utter crap. There is another game of the handful I've chosen to highlight that's also nothing but minigames. It's not as bad, but it is quite funny. Now you may have thought that advertising games wouldn't get much weirder than the Japanese-only PS1 title Pepsi Man, mightn't you? Well, that's where you're wrong. In fact, that's far from the only title out there that's filled with Pepsi branding. Why, here's Pepsi all over the world. This is another promotional game only for the Amiga from 1991, it's by Ego Software again, and it's also German. Most of these games are German as it happens. This simple affair gives you a few brief minigames. Two of them, one where you collect drips of oil in Alaska, and another where you try to stop cups of tea from falling in Japan, are basically the same. In Australia, you control a kangaroo as he tries to avoid obstacles en route to a Pepsi sign, and in Ireland you do some fishing before relaxing with a nice cool drink on the riverbank. The funniest minigame lies in Egypt. You have to guide your man here across the lake in a Frogger style, jumping on top of crocodiles and all of that, in order to reach the conveniently placed Pepsi vending machine that's on the other side. It's all rather sly and, yeah, stupid. There is actually a much stronger game chock full of Pepsi branding. Well, a little bit of branding anyhow. 1988 saw the release of Mad Mix Pepsi Challenge for the C64 and other platforms by US Gold. And it's actually quite good. It is fairly derivative. Essentially it's a Pac-Man type game but with a few little added features like conveyor belts and different power-ups. There isn't too much relation to Pepsi aside from the logo, but the game itself isn't bad. US Gold did this sort of thing more than once. If you think back to a couple of videos ago and that terrible Amiga port of Thunderblade, remember that it had Pepsi advertising all over it? You even took off on a Pepsi sponsored helipad. Anywho, Mad Mix is an okay enough commercial title with a bit of advertising tacked onto it. It was a bit of a borderline case for inclusion here, but I thought it worth sticking in. Here's another half-decent game that's also chock full of branding, even more so than Mad Mix. This is Tony and Friends in Kellogg's Land, released in Germany only for the Amiga, and created by no less a studio than the almighty Factor 5. You take control of Tony the Tiger in the main, but you can also on occasion switch to his mates who have different abilities. You've got Coco the Monkey, Toucan Sam, and even Diggum Frog. You know, the frog that advertises smacks. The end result is, as you might expect, a rather typical European platformer, but that alone makes it better than most everything else you see here. Because, let's face it, aside from the odd shocking gem like One Step Beyond, a lot of these Advert games and promotional games just aren't all that good. I mean, just look at Sony Game, for example. Here you play as some ridiculous looking Walkman mascot come to life, and you have to find pictures of various Sony products in a stupidly short time limit, and the whole thing is a flick screen affair that looks like it was knocked up in about 5 minutes. I suppose at the very least this wasn't commercially released. Tony and Friends was worthy of being stuck on shelves. But can you imagine some bizarro world where this crappy promotional game right here is Sony's only contribution to the world of video games? How strange would that be? Okay, we have a couple more. We're going to finish with some rather odd dealios for the Spectrum. Why not have a quick dip into the world of fast food? Now of course there's plenty of McDonald's games, we all know that they're not worth covering. Those cheapo Burger King games on the Xbox 360, well, they're not really worth it either. However, there was surprisingly a Burger King game on the Spectrum. Here's Whopper Chase, released in 1987. Oddly enough, it only came out in Spain. Anyway, you play as a Whopper, shock of horrors. You have an utterly terrible job. You are a sentient Whopper who can make your way to the patron so that you can be eaten alive. However, before you reach him, you must collect the 4 different parts of the Burger King logo. This is so the customer knows that what he has ordered is a legitimate Whopper, flame grilled to delicious perfection. For some reason there's other chefs, presumably from other fast food companies, and other sentient foodstuffs who want to stop you from being eaten and killed by these customers that you're gonna have to avoid. It's all pretty crap as you can see, but my lord, it's also very weird. We've got McDonald's, we've got Burger King, and guess what? We also have a game representing the UK's champion, the old burger house that makes people bristle with nostalgia. Wimpy. Here's Mr. Wimpy, a game by Ocean Software from 1984. Once I had visions of getting a copy of this game and making a video where I actually reviewed this game at a Wimpy, seeing as most of the few Wimpies that are still around are actually right here in Essex. I still have multiple locations within walking distance. However, doing such a thing is currently impossible and Wimpy is crap anyway, so nah, this'll do. The game itself is quite basic indeed. It starts off with a simple game where you have to get ingredients from one side to the other and take them back home, and after that it becomes a Burger Time clone. Much like Wimpy itself, it's aggressively mediocre at best. You might play this and hope to relive some childhood nostalgia, just as you would eat the burgers every once in a while or, I don't know, get a brown derby, but in the end you're most likely going to be rather disappointed. We move from one 1980s British icon almost seamlessly to another. Shakin' Stevens. We all know and love Shaky, don't we? He strutted around like a man whose claim to fame was winning a Best Elvis impersonator competition at a Bognor Regis Butlins in 1974, but an error in the TV schedule saw him become a star by mistake. Although it has to be said, for all his crapness, there is something quite endearing about good old Shaky. Anywho, Shaky was even the star of a game that was quite simply called The Shaky Game. It's a very simple game indeed. You've got a single maze, you have to avoid bugs, and find your way to the centre, to Shaky's old house. Whether you win or lose, you'll get this picture of Shakin' Stevens and his signature. Haha, great, eh? I mean, I'm sure you all want to play this game right now. You may be shocked that something like this was ever on the shelves, but this is something a bit different. You could only find this game at the end of the cassette version of Shaky's 1983 album, The Bop Won't Stop, meaning this was actually a unique little mix of medias back in the day, even if the game's obviously terrible. In fact, here's the man himself at the end of that album, introducing the game.
Hi, this is Shaky. If you've got a Sinclair Spectrum 48K computer, why don't you try my game? The program follows shortly. If you haven't, please fast forward to the end of the tape, so that you can listen to the album again.
It's late.
I mean, you can tell he's very clued up on all of this newfangled technology by the way he says 48K Spectrum. can't you? Jeez. I mean, that's almost as bad as saying Nintendo NES. Lastly, well, this game may not necessarily be promoting a brand or anything like that, but it's certainly promoting something we were all told to do in the 80s. We were told to just say no. While you may be familiar with other anti-drug efforts from games back then, from the winners don't use drugs splash screens to the rather depressing pusher-related Death in the Grange Hill game, you won't find an anti-drugs message quite as stark and as harrowing as the one in Drug Watch, a game created for the Nottinghamshire Constabulary as a way of getting the message across to the kids with their computers to not do drugs, take coke, take pills, sniff glue and all of that. You're a young boy trying to make your way in the world, but in order to get anywhere, you have to avoid the pusher. What do these pushers do? Well, going by this game, they form an orderly line and march in a Space Invader-like formation towards you, while constantly throwing pills, needles and the word drug in your direction. But you can respond by throwing the word no right back at them, at which point they'll stop. If you do this for a few levels, you'll be congratulated for saying no. If you fail and your resistance drops down to 0, well, guess what? You die! You die! You die! Now I cannot do that as well as John Robertson can, but I imagine I could probably make a better game than this one. It is quite a hilarious piece of anti-drug nostalgia, to the point where you wonder if it's some sort of parody. Was this created by Chris Morris, perhaps, as some sort of obscure promotion for the drugs episode of Brass Eye? That would be the sort of thing he'd do. But no, this game was real. It's even got cover art and everything. It might just be the weirdest piece of specky software I've ever encountered. And believe me, I've seen plenty. I think that for now, I can't top Drug Watch, so it's time to end the video. There are certainly many more promotional games out there. I'm sure a few of you are clamouring for some analysis of the likes of, I don't know, Mr. Pip for DOS, or a whole raft of games that appear to have been commissioned by German government departments, or various other strange obscurities that are still yet to be discovered. Because as is often the case, the likes of Pepsi Man or Sneakkin or even Coke Wins, while quite strange, are not but the tip of the iceberg. So join us next time, when no doubt we'll have more weird tidbits from the world of computers to look at. But until then, as ever, bye for now. With it getting close to Christmas, I thought that for this time of year I should reminisce on the time when Christmas TV used to be a lot more important. Nowadays, the choice of festive programmes on the box isn't very good, whereas back in the good old days the selections were, well, they also usually weren't very good, but they had a significantly more captive audience, one that was completely stuffed to bursting with their Christmas lunch and capable of little more except drooling on the sofa in front of Noel's house party. Nowadays there's a lot more things to distract people while they're struggling to keep their turkey down, and the Christmas programmes on the telly are damn near as unimportant as the regular programmes are during the rest of the year. So today I have a little selection box of TV licensed games, along with one radio one, all of which we haven't actually covered a whole lot previously on the channel, aside from the odd list here and there. I mean, running a repeat of something like Supergran would be fitting enough for a video inspired by festive British television, but there's plenty more intriguing stuff out there on the old ZX Spectrum. So let's get into the 8 treats we've got here, starting with a bit of comedy. The Young Ones, gloriously anarchic, highly influential, and it never really ran a proper Christmas special, but we're still going to run with it here because the game based on The Young Ones, along with being rather abysmal, does come with a rather intriguing story behind it. The game came out in 1986, a little while after the end of the series, but with the quartet still very fresh in people's minds, and it wasn't exactly released by a name people expected. Say hello to Orpheus Software. Orpheus aren't too well known at all on micros like the Specky and C64, but they were championed by those who got behind the almighty OREC for the games they released on there. Orpheus were headed up by a man named Paul Kaufman, and they'd spun off from Tansoft, the official label for OREC games that was created by computer makers Tangerine. It was Paul who had the idea for making a game based off of The Young Ones, and to the surprise of magazines at the time, they managed to beat big names like Virgin to the licence. The idea of a Young Ones game certainly did make some waves, but, well, it turned out to be a disaster. The idea behind the Young Ones game is actually quite sound. Bukowski the landlord has finally decided to kick our heroes out of their home. You pick either Rick, Neil, Vivian or Mike, and you have to collect 10 or so of the items that belong to that specific character before leaving with everybody else. The other computer characters will naturally be picking up items themselves. There's a lot of dialogue that's similar to what you would hear on the show, and you'd have to use lists to figure out exactly what items you need, along with completing some quite fiendish puzzles to get them. So far, so typical micro-adventure style title really. But the task itself is actually a huge one. There are a lot of items hidden all over the place, and it can quickly become very challenging to keep track of it all. There are more clues dotted around the game's instructions and box, which is, it has to be said, absolutely lovely looking, but the layout of the game can kind of make your head spin, the feel of the show doesn't come across too well, and most who played the game just ended up being very frustrated by it. It's pretty easy to see why when you try and get your head around it, in all honesty. An ambitious game, but one that does definitely miss the mark. That's only half of it, mind. This license did, unfortunately, end up killing Orpheus Software as a whole. How so? Well, the game ended up taking a hell of a long time to make, mostly because Paul Kaufman and the rest of the guys had to spend a lot of time in meetings with Rick Mail, Ben Elton and Lisa Mayer at just about every stage of the production. From what I can gather, mostly in comments on Zeus Dad's videos, the almighty Zeus being as close to a champion of the game as you'll find, they were very nice people, but they definitely did stick their oars in, and plenty of changes were demanded. The upshot of all of this was, of course, delays, and despite taking a big order for 10,000 copies of the game from Boots and other shops, the game fatally missed its deadline for release in Christmas of 1985. When it did get released, it was also still quite buggy, although urban legends that the game was only completable when you played as Vivian do appear to be unfounded. Orpheus never managed to get out a bug-fixed version of the game. Not long after its release, they were out of business, wrecked by the loss of money due to not getting the game out in time. Quite a shame, really. They're hardly a bad studio, and the game does show some creativity and ambition even if it ends up failing. But this can be the result of such failures, unfortunately. One other funny thing, the Young Ones also caused your Sinclair to get into a spot of bother. During their coverage of the game, they ran a quite extensive preview of it in their second issue, including a lovely drawing of the game's house, and it also got the front cover complete with caricatures of the smelly student quartet. It appears, however, that one of the Young Ones took umbrage with their portrayal. A couple of issues later, YS ran a little blurb saying that Nigel Planer, aka Neil the hippie, and his agents had run the office and they were absolutely furious about the drawing. Hell, they might have even threatened to sue, although nothing like that actually came to fruition. It is rather funny that a comic caricature of a character in a comedy would cause such a load of bristling, it has to be said. Don Priestley. Something of a late bloomer in the world of the Specky. He was a teacher, and he was in his 40s by the time he'd got into coding thanks to night classes, a path that led him to making games for the Specky, largely through DK-Tronics. You can pretty quickly tell a Priestley game by the excellent artwork. They're not the fastest movers, but they employ big sprites, dwarfing most other games. Not only that, but they're full of colour, and there's not a lot in the way of clash. He's definitely worthy of a bigger video at some point, but this is a good setting for a quick-fire Don Priestley triple bill of TV licenses. We've got a good one, a bad one, and a, well, weird one. Here's the good. Of course, it's Trapdoor. Released by Piranha in 1986, and based off the children's TV show and its strange cabal of castle monsters, you play as the almighty Burke and you perform tasks for the Finn upstairs. Generally, it's another micro-style puzzling adventure where you pick up objects and use them to complete puzzles, but Trapdoor certainly stands out due to the aforementioned presentation. I mean, Just look at it. Absolutely chock full of life and personality. Even if playing this might be tricky today if you're not familiar with it due to the slow speed, it was certainly something back then, selling handsomely and being put up for awards. Lovely stuff. It's not quite Priestley's best game. For me, that honour goes to his totally original and absolutely fantastic final micro title in 1989, Gregory Loses His Clock, but it's certainly going to get second place. On the bad side, here's Benny Hill's Madcap Chase. To my knowledge, this is the only game that features the behattered, surprisingly athletic and famously frugal comedian, and it's not exactly a glittering one. The game is quite simple, really. You play as Benny, and you have to pick up certain items, a lady's clothes in the first level, apples in the second, for example, and then take them back to your box with the owner in hot pursuit, dodging obstacles that change position whenever you re-enter the screen. It's, well, very simplistic, and kind of gets old after a couple of minutes, unfortunately. It's perhaps only amusing when Benny fails in his objective and gets thoroughly stomped on as a result. Don Priestley's wonderful graphics are very much in full swing at least, but I actually think he's a rather poor fit for this game. Sure, they're big sprites, and the main character is very obviously Benny Hill, but the slow speed of movement? Well, it doesn't exactly fit what the man's famous for, does it? The game promises a madcap chase and, needless to say, it does not deliver. Using an emulator, I suppose that I can ramp up the speed and create an experience that appears more accurate to the TV show, so cue a badly hummed version of Yakety Sax. Well, that certainly looks more accurate. Still doesn't make this game any good, mind you. Far too wafer thin in the gameplay department to warrant all that much attention, I'm afraid. As for the weird one, well, we've got Minder, the classic comedy drama featuring everyone's favourite chariot-chomping spiv Arthur Daly and his streetwise yet long-suffering bodyguard Terry. When I think of Minder and the ZX Spectrum, two things come to mind. There's the unclear user fake cover Crash Ran that got them into severely hot water with Sinclair user and EMAP, and this intriguing little 1985 game from Mr. Priestley. It's not the usual big sprites that he's famous for, but it is quite faithful with the licence. Appropriately enough, it's a trading game. You've got 2 weeks to make as much moolah as possible, and you do so through a whole load of nice little earners, talking to dealers and doing lots of buying and selling of items, either from casuals you meet at the Winchester Club or from the more regular dealers. Most of this is done through conversation, and there's plenty of opportunity for haggling, but it pays to keep things simple when using the text parser. Once you've completed a deal, you'll want to get Terry to collect or deliver the items, then he'll give you the cash when you next see him. You can also use him to dump goods from your lockup fast if needed, and naturally, he can be your minder and keep you company. Useful if you ever run into a spot of bother, either with some dealer who's approaching you with larcenous intent, or the ever-roaming Sergeant Chisholm who'll always want to collar you, especially if you're handling stolen goods. And naturally, most of the items you're dealing with will be very hooky indeed. It definitely pays to read the instructions with this one so that you can actually figure out what on earth to do. This sure isn't Manic Mino after all. But once you get it, it's a clever little game. You can even use appropriate slang like a fiver or a pony when you're making the dodgy deals. Some people really do love this one. It's a simple enough trader, but it's dolled up very nicely with its rogues gallery of people to talk to and various nods to the original show. It feels corny and kind of nonsensical to say that this game could be so good for you, but it's certainly worth a try. Let's turn the TV off and relax with a briar pipe and a bit of the old wireless, shall we? There aren't exactly a lot of licensed games based on radio shows full stop, but there is one for Britain's longest running soap opera, The Archers, a show on Radio 4 that has, believe it or not, been broadcast continuously since 1951. It's all nice and quaint and country life, telling the light tales of the various families of the fictional village of Ambridge. The existence of an Archer's game is a little odd in and of itself, although if this were a straight-to adaptation where you just played a character and pottered around Brookfield Farm, it might not warrant much attention. This is a text adventure, after all. However, it's a text adventure by Level 9, published by Mosaic, and they take things in quite an odd direction. It appears first off as if you are indeed playing as one of the show's characters and pursuing a storyline. You can pick from one of the four mainstays, including Jack Woolley, Eddie Grundy, and Nelson Gabriel. You don't use the regular text parser and commands. Instead, you get a multiple choice to decide what your character does. This appears to be even simpler than usual, and you might wonder if there is all that much game here, but it soon becomes clear that actually, you're playing as the show's runner. You find this out when you receive your first memo detailing the show's current audience numbers, what they make of the current plotline, and if the characters are behaving in a believable manner or not. It is, in fact, your job to guide the show's plot and characters' actions in a way that's coherent and in the spirit of the show. So yes, directing Elizabeth Archer to snort up a line of Bisto and rob the local post office might not be the best of ideas, and will likely get you fired. It's all surprisingly meta, and pretty engrossing once you get into the idea of the game. I don't think it's that remembered nowadays at all, but it got some quite positive notes back in the day from the likes of Crash, and I can't think of too many other text-based games that are like this one. Mind you, there is another similar one that is also a classic UK TV licence, and we're going to be looking at that one next. We stick with Mosaic for the game that would prove to be their last title, but is actually one that I have always adored, Yes Prime Minister from 1988. In this game you play out a week in the life of PM Jim Hacker, and the bulk of your time is spent navigating your way through various meetings based on the situations that crop up. For example, a party MP may have punched out the leader of the opposition in the Commons, and you have to figure out what to do about it. Most of your meetings will be with your humble servant and ultra-manipulative Cabinet Secretary Sir Humphrey Appleby and his ever-pedantic underling Bernard Woolley, and your dialogue choices will affect your party's standings in the polls. Ideally, you end the week better off than where you started. This is somewhat similar to The Archers in that it's a text-based game where you largely have multiple choices. No parser here. I really enjoy this game, although it probably helps if you're a fan of the show. Happily, it's one of my favourites. The game does a really good job of emulating the writings of Jonathan Lynn and Anthony J, and it helps that it does have something of a literary underpinning. It's based more on the books of the series rather than the programme itself, with excerpts from diary entries commenting on Hacker's decisions and several more layers added to YPM's satirical and verbose wit. Those books, taking the form of Jim Hacker's private diaries, are also highly recommended indeed, and it's a good idea for the game to take from them. If you're a fan of one of the BBC's greatest sitcoms, then you absolutely need to play this now. It still might be worth a look if you aren't, as again there's not a whole lot of micro games like it, even in the field of text. It's always good to relax at Christmas with a game show, isn't it? There's always plenty of Christmas game show specials on, chock full of people who are apparently celebrities, having fun and raising money for charity. There are of course plenty of specky versions of game shows I could choose from, not usually the flashiest bits of software, although they're generally designed for more than one person to have fun with. There's mainstays like Bob's Full House, Every Second Counts, and Blockbusters, complete with its images of Bob Holness. There's the rather basic Countdown, a game where you can just make any old thing out of the letters that you've been given and tell the computer that yes, Ingzgotthal is in fact a word. If you want a whole bunch of silly faces and topical questions from the late 80s, you could have a question of sport or Mike Reed's pop quiz. Bullseye could be a good one, but unfortunately it was made by Maxon Software, the same people who made EastEnders, and therefore it most certainly is not a good one. But I would like to specifically concentrate on the computer game adaptation of 321, a show that's always guaranteed to have a big old Christmas special, complete with celebrities taking part in some silly play or whatever, a festive Dusty Bin, and the ever-present Ted Rogers. While most of the micro game show adaptations are pretty basic indeed, and this game isn't much of an exception, 321 does have quite the odd little story behind it that makes it worth looking at. The game itself is designed for 3 couples to play, and it's split into 3 parts. The first and longest one is the word association round. You pick an envelope and you get a subject, islands or car parts for example. Then a bunch of words will flash on the screen one by one, and you pick whether they're associated with that subject or not. Quite simple, really. This goes on for a couple of rounds, and then you get the second part, which is, an arcade game. Yeah, it kind of takes a turn. I'm not sure exactly what you do here. Presumably 2 players crowd the keyboard and they run around a bit, jumping on the clouds and trying to avoid being hit by them. If you're hit, you lose points. That's the idea, but it's not exactly well thought through. You could just move the 2 players to the far left and right on the screen and keep them still, because those clouds are never going to touch you there, and you'll just get 999 points. So, yeah, pretty bad. The third part is the Lucky Dip round. Objects are shown to you, and you decide whether to keep them or discard them. If you discard one, it tells you that you've missed the chance to be entered in a draw for an item. This could include bad items like, of course, Dusty Bin, but the best prizes include a colour TV, a bicycle, and even a draw for a holiday for 2 in sunny Spain. There's no riddles here as there is in the original TV show. In fact, the objects bear no relation at all to what you end up getting, and in the end you're entered in a draw for whatever item you end up with. Funnily enough, this can include a lot of computer-related things, such as a micro drive, an Interface 1, a ZX Spectrum Plus, or games from the likes of New Generation and Virgin. Finally, the game ends, you're given a summary of how everyone's done, and weirdly, you're then given a chance to record your results onto a blank tape. Finally, you end the game, and the tape self-destructs in 5 seconds. Or rather, we go back to basic. Even this part is weird, because it's a fake return to basic, which is something I'm not sure I've ever seen before. One last little bit of, actually kind of witty humour. So yeah, that's 321, and as you can see, it's not great. However, there's certainly some oddities. Why on earth would you need to record your results, for example? Are you actually going to load that tape up and look back on them fondly someday? Hey, remember when we played that really bad 321 Specky game? Well, there's more to this than just a plain game show adaptation, as it turns out. 321 was never sold in stores. You actually had to send off to Yorkshire Television to get the game in the post, and those prize draws in the game, they represent an entry into an actual prize draw for an actual real-life item. When you finish the game, you send off the tape you recorded and a registration card to be entered into a draw for the items that you won. The game itself had a large involvement from Cheetah. These folks were largely associated with joysticks and other peripherals, from the more famed likes of the 125 and the Bug to weird stuff like the Spectrum, Sweet Talker and the Tortoise, but they also did a few games under a label called Cheetah Soft. The game even features actual audio from Mr. Ted Rogers. This audio does play during the game, although it's easier to do this on a real Specky than it is on an emulator, seeing as it's separate audio that you would have to unplug the tape recorder's earphone connection from the Specky in order to hear properly. Thankfully, someone has preserved the audio files so that we can listen in on Ted's signature enthusiasm for a bit.
Hi everybody, I'm Ted Rogers and I'd like to invite you to an exciting new way to play 321 with me all year round. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of fun, and if you feel like laughing, applauding, or generally making a fool of yourself, well then you just go right ahead. Just as long as you don't distract your partner or your opponent. Now, we're going to test your intelligence, coordination, and judgment in 3 distinct phases of the game, and I'll be there to help you every step of the way. We've got all the major elements of 3-2-1 with some fabulous prizes to be won. And, of course, there is my old mate Dusty Bin, so don't forget...
Now, you might wonder if this rather unique gimmick was successful. Certainly I don't think that any of the other game show adaptations tried to do anything like this. It doesn't seem like it was a success. 3-2-1 is a very obscure game indeed, and a specky tape of the game was only found relatively recently when it came up for auction on eBay. A C64 version is also out there and can be seen on retrocollector.org, but to date it has not been dumped. It doesn't seem like it was advertised on the programme itself, and who even knows if those prize draws ever actually took place. One more thing. Like the TV show itself, this game is actually a Spanish adaptation. This whole thing had originally been done in 1984 by Belton's Informatica for the original Spanish version of the show, Un, Dos, Tres, Respondo otra vez, prize draws, audio files and all. Perhaps that was more successful. Who knows? Another fun fact is that this game can be won on any Spectrum at all, even a 16K specky. Considering that this 3-2-1 game was seemingly released in early 1986 or so, it has been suggested by folks like the almighty Games That Weren't that 3-2-1 is, officially, the last game ever released that could be won on a 16K ZX Spectrum in the commercial lifetime of the system. And with that, yeah, that's about all we've got here. It has to be said I certainly got an awful lot more out of this adaptation of a really terrible game show starring Ted Bloody Rogers than I ever bargained for, from a factoid point at least. Our final TV show licensed game represents the big showcase, the big Christmas episode of a drama or comedy, one that's hopefully going to garner lots of attention and have lots of people watching. Now I do suppose, seeing as the always horrifically grim festive episodes of soap operas where there's always guaranteed to be a whole load of blood, guts and death traditionally top the Christmas ratings, that I could have done EastEnders here. But no, I'm gonna leave that one because it's just plain god-awful and little else. Instead, let's have a look at Doctor Who Dalek Attack. The Doctor normally makes an appearance at Christmas after all, at least in the revived form, and this game does have some interesting facts surrounding it. Hell, a Doctor Who licensed game is somewhat intriguing seeing as surprisingly there's not a whole lot of them, and what there is generally isn't that good. Indeed, if you're aware of Dalek Attack already, you probably know that it is absolutely not a good game. Perhaps you've played this alternative software stinker on the Amiga or on the Commodore 64. Folks like Chinivision, for example, have excellent videos breaking down every version of the game and why it's worth less than a guff from K1's arse. But the ZX Spectrum version is a bit different to these ones, only slightly in the game itself, but mainly because it's an example of defiance. Or desperation, perhaps. In any case, it does represent something of a rage against the dying of the light, as we shall explain. The game itself is rather generic. Obviously, you play as the Doctor. While the original BBC series had been cancelled a few years prior to this game, the Doctor in question is still the 7th one, that being Sylvester McCoy. The game itself is a mazy platformer where you have to explore each level and rescue the trapped humans that the Daleks, Ogrons and other monsters are using for food. You do so in various locations from London to Paris, New York, Tokyo, and ultimately the Daleks' home planet of Skaro where you'll have a final battle with Davros. The Spectrum game is a bit stripped down from other versions. There's no opening level where you ride a hoverboard through the sewers, and a whole bunch of other enemies are missing. You only get Daleks, Ogrons and Robomen, and the Doctor uses his sonic screwdriver as a weapon, although it's not much more than a pea shooter. The game isn't that offensive, it doesn't control badly, it moves quickly, and the graphics aren't awful, although they are naturally monochrome. Hell, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's the worst version of a generally piss-poor game. But yeah, it's not exactly special at all, and it didn't warrant much in the way of good ratings. With all that said, it was a bit of a surprise that the game actually came out for the Spectrum in the first place, as we're just about to detail. So the majority of versions of Dalek Attack came out in and around the autumn of 1992, and a ZX Spectrum version was advertised for around then. However, this version of it was delayed, and news of it seemed to dry up as we got further into 1993. In the May 93 issue of Your Sinclair, it was revealed that the Specky version had finally been finished, but Alternative didn't think it was worth releasing it. YS weren't too happy about this, and they implored their readers to fill in a form and send it to them to show their interest as part of a campaign called Save Our Specky, something they'd done previously to secure the Specky release of Nigel Mansell's World Championship from Gremlin. And yeah, the campaign worked. The next issue saw YS bring the good news that Alternative had decided to put Dalek Attack out after all, and the July issue saw them review it. Still, even after putting so much energy behind getting the game out, Your Sinclair could only muster up a score of 56% for it because, well, as previously mentioned, it wasn't all that good. But with all this in mind, seeing as it came out so late and that it was the last new game that YS ever reviewed, it's probably safe to say that Doctor Who Dalek Attack is, drumroll please, the last full-price ZX Spectrum game released in its commercial lifetime. This game was, indeed, the very end. Of a sort, anyway. The campaign also mentions Alternative dithering over whether to release a specky version of their Alvin and the Chipmunks game that was also slated to come out on the Amiga, C64 and Amstrad, but in the end this one didn't come out. Mind you, that one didn't end up coming out for any platform at all, despite apparently being completed. Alternative are, of course, one of the few independent micro games companies from their era who are still kicking around today, so one wonders if any details on that title remain in their archives. But the effort of Your Sinclair to successfully convince them of the virtues of releasing Dalek Attack on the Spectrum does deserve a bit of respect, because even if the game didn't turn out to be that good, it would have just disappeared into the ether if they hadn't tried to give something to those who were still standing by their specky in the middle of 1993. And that's about it. Hopefully you've enjoyed this look at some specky UK TV show licenses. There should at least be some interesting stuff to look at here, even if a few of the games aren't exactly brimming with quality. Obviously there are plenty more titles I could feature here, because there is no end of strange and ridiculous licensed games available for this platform and others. But hopefully this little selection box has lined your stomach up nicely over this festive period. Thank you very much for watching, hopefully you've enjoyed it, and in the immortal words of the First Doctor, a happy Christmas to all of you at home. Bye for now. EA's Godfather game from the mid-2000s is a fabulous title, one of my favourite licensed games, and something I'll be making a video on very soon. But there's something else related to the classic series that I want to look at first. A lot of people thought that making a game based on a film as revered as The Godfather was a ballsy thing to do back when EA's title was announced, but, well, they must have forgotten about the time that a Godfather game was released back in 1991. Or likelier they didn't know the first thing about it because it wasn't any good. The earlier Godfather game is an interesting beast. I mean, the idea of a Godfather game is surely an exciting one, right? Think of the possibilities. It could have been an adventure game, or a strategy title, or something else with a bit more depth to it. After all, this is a pretty different time to the usual action flicks that got games back then. Imagine what a Godfather point-and-click game would have been like. And then look at what we actually got and be amazed at the complete lack of ambition and imagination that's on display. It is quite the achievement to take The Godfather and make it quite this tedious. Although it does have some positives, ones that are perhaps obvious, and it does have some intriguing story behind it. 'Cause, well, surely this wasn't all that this time was ever going to be, right? So what went wrong? The Godfather's first game was released in late 1991 by US Gold and was initially announced by magazines a year previously. At first it was announced that US Gold had picked up rights to make a game based on the third Godfather movie, which was just out in cinemas, although it didn't quite end up working out that way. And indeed, the initial announcement wasn't just for one game. As detailed in Amiga Action's December 1990 news tidbit, US Gold intended to publish 2 games, one being a high-level interactive adventure game, or a point-and-click, and the other being an action game. Amiga Action really liked hyphens. Commodore Format also mentioned the game in late 1990, saying that the first of the duo was likely to come out in June for the venerable C64. US Gold double-dipping in this way wasn't uncommon at the time. They'd already done it with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, publishing both the Lucasfilm point-and-click as well as an infamously hard and frankly detestable action game made by Tiertex. You know, the one where Indy can only use his whip a few times because, I don't know, he's thrown out his shoulder or some other crap. Fellow UK software giants and frenemies Ocean also did it in 1990 with Nightbreed, releasing both the rather odd interactive movie and the rather generic action game, while US Gold would actually do it again with Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. While everyone remembers the classic adventure game, virtually nobody remembers the completely humdrum isometric action game that was made by Attention to Detail. In this instance, the action game was to be handled by Creative Materials, while the adventure game side of things was given to French developers Delphine Software, who already had a proven track record in this department thanks to Future Wars, Cruise for a Corpse, and Operation Stealth, which had been positioned as a James Bond tie-in game in the US, not to mention, of course, also making Eric Chahy's seminal Another World in 1991. Being that this was something of a breakthrough year for Delphine, magazines were curious to see just how the two games were going to take a narrative as complex and as epic as the Godfather saga and turn it into something playable and in any way understandable. By the middle of 1991, the license had switched slightly to be something based on all three movies rather than just part 3. Some magazines were optimistic, while others were a little sceptical. Looking at some of the previews kicking around, it is amazing how, well, thin on the ground some of them are. For example, you have a double-page spread from Zero magazine that has a few very nice-looking screenshots from the action game, but most of the article is a silly one that describes a bunch of comedy dons. Not exactly the meatiest of pieces, but well, that's what you've got to do if you've got pages in a magazine to fill and not a whole lot of info to actually fill them up with. Right up to late 1991, when the action game was finally released, Amiga Action had initially promised screenshots and details from the game as early as the start of 91, although that didn't happen, there was still word that US Gold were going to publish a Godfather adventure game by Delphine, with it getting mentions in reviews for the Creative Materials title. However, one might have worried that a year on from the initial announcement of the Birmingham boys' snaring of the licence, there was absolutely no detail on just what form the adventure game was going to take. No screenshots, no previews, no nothing. Sure enough, after the action game was released, the adventure game basically dropped out of existence in the pages of the mags, never to be mentioned again. When previews for Delphine's next game, Flashback, start to surface in the middle of 1992, no mention is made of the Godfather title they were supposed to be working on. The 1 September issue simply says that they've been quiet since the release of Another World. But then, the supposed Godfather game and Flashback were, in a somewhat twisted way, one and the same. Now, I did have a little coverage of how Flashback came from the bombed out embers of the unreleased Godfather project a few years ago when I covered the game itself, but it's worth revisiting and trying to get as much detail as possible on what the French studio was planning because, well, it is still such a wonderfully high concept idea, being both completely out there and just the sort of thing you would expect from guys like Delphine. Their idea, which they spent a good few months working on and building a demo for, was to retell the Godfather story in the future. A man, quite possibly Michael Corleone himself, would have to escape from mafia hitmen in a futuristic world where the mob still very much existed. It was a pretty far cry from the promised faithful adaptation of the trilogy's settings, it has to be said. A lot of these details come from Paul Crisset himself, leader of the project, who was interviewed in various places such as Retrogamer and Eurogamer about Flashback in 2013, although the game's strange origins were mentioned as early as 1997 in an Edge magazine interview with Denis Mercier, one of the game's designers. Unfortunately, Crisset and Delphine ended up straying way too far from the original trappings of The Godfather for US Gold to let the game go ahead in this form. However, they did love the idea itself and what Delphine were demoing, and saw to it that it would eventually get released as Flashback, so it was hardly a complete loss. It has to be said that unless you knew of these behind-the-scenes details, you probably wouldn't recognise all that much of the Godfather in the story of Conrad B. Hart as it came out, although the game is certainly filled with plenty of cinematic stylings and references beyond that. However, with things playing out in this way, and the proposed Godfather game already delayed somewhat, US Gold were now in the position of having an action game on the go, but no proposed adventure game whatsoever. So rather than trying to salvage that with another developer, they decided to just concentrate on said action game. One imagines that the action game wasn't exactly supposed to be the main event. That would surely have been the adventure title. But US Gold decided to invest that energy and money into making Flashback a hit, which, of course, it was. Still, the Godfather action game was planned to hit plenty of platforms. The Amiga, ST, DOS, C64, Mega Drive and Master System were all going to get a version of the title, so it's not as if it was abandoned completely. However, well, much like in the case of the action game based on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the Godfather's action game was going to be found very severely wanting. Perhaps now it's time to have a proper look at this somewhat unfortunate title, concentrating on the Amiga version. When the game starts and you see the intro, you may well get pretty excited. It certainly does look appropriately epic and marvellous, and these superb graphics continue into the first stage. This is the one major highlight of the whole game, of course. The way it looks is amazing, with beautiful bitmap backgrounds that are absolutely chock full of detail and life. Every single main level is a great picture, as are all the different shooting gallery scenes. These high quality graphics may be the reason that the game came on a beastly 6 floppies, but it unquestionably gets top marks in the visual department, as it is surely one of the best looking games the Amiga had seen up to that point. The credit for all this work goes to a man named Pete Lyon. Lyon cut his teeth in the British sci-fi community of the 1970s, produced many works of art for people and conventions that he helped run, and started contributing to computer games in the mid-1980s. He didn't necessarily work on the best games, but his graphics are uniformly excellent across all of them. The likes of Airball, Astaroth and The Killing Game Show are amongst the games he worked on, alongside other licensed titles such as Fright Night and Karate Kid Part 2, as well as Amnios by Psygnosis, which he also did the game design for. So you can certainly marvel at the game's looks. It may well look like a blinder in pictures. And while there's not a whole lot of music in the game, the sound effects are pretty good as well. But playing it is, alas, a different matter. You play as an unnamed Don of the Corleone family, could be Vito, could be Michael, over 5 levels set in different locales and times, starting in New York City circa 1946, going through Las Vegas, Havana, Miami, and finishing up in 1981 Atlantic City. It's a side-scrolling shooter and little else. You walk down the street, shooting any other gangster in your path and trying to avoid hitting bystanders and cops with stray bullets. You get 2 meters, one for health and one for your standing in the family, and shooting innocents affects the latter to the point where you'll be disowned by the family if it goes down to 0. However, it does go up when you shoot gangsters. The streets are busy and mobsters move around quite a lot, meaning that not shooting civvies is a lot harder than it sounds. Although amusingly, the police don't appear to give a toss about the massive gunfight happening all around them as they plod along on their beat. The difficulty is pretty damn high. You only get 1 life for all of this, and admittedly I had to use a cheat code in order to see anything beyond the first level. A level usually ends by fighting a guy armed with a Tommy gun before you go off to a couple of little shooting gallery scenes. The one at the end of the first level, for example, takes place in a barber shop, and you give these soldados the old Albert Anastasia treatment whenever they turn their chair to shoot at you. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with a game just being a side-scrolling shooter, as long as it's a well-made one. But, graphics aside, The Godfather soon runs into major issues. In the main, it is just so frickin' slow. Unfortunately, this was a game that was designed to run the same on both the Amiga and the Atari ST, and when you combine that with the quality level of the graphics, sadly this runs at an abysmal pace. It's been thoroughly kneecapped, and the level of unresponsiveness makes everything a total drudge. There's not exactly much variation either. You basically do the same thing over and over, walking right and shooting until you reach the finish. Your character can't even jump, so there's no platforming or anything. You do get some baddies who shoot at you from across the street later on, meaning that you have to shoot out of the screen to hit them, but other than that it's not long until you have exhausted this game's supply of goons. There's only one time in the game where you even go above street level, a little section of the first level where you climb up a fire escape that has the promise of being able to do that again, but it never happens. The shooting galleries also tend to play out the same every time, meaning that as much as they look nice, they also get boring pretty quickly. The only one that somewhat differs is the very last one. You have to protect Michael Corleone while a helicopter strafes around shooting every other mob boss in the room, lucky coat or not. This last scene is also, really, the only one that has any real relation to the movies, being that it's a depiction of the Atlantic City massacre from Part 3. Which, of course, leads to another significant issue. Even more than usual for licensed tie-ins, The Godfather bears precious little relation to its source material. Now, in a lot of cases where the tie-in is for a shallower action movie or the like, that perhaps wouldn't matter too much. But for something that has as much depth and character as The Godfather does, yeah, this was a real bone of contention for reviewers at the time. Beyond that one scene at the end, there's nothing here that you'd recognise as being from any Godfather film. None of the characters, none of the locations from the movie really, just nothing at all. You could give this a more generic mob name like, I don't know, Paulie Jr. eats gabagool with the fishes or whatever, and you still probably wouldn't think that it was even ripping off The Godfather beyond being based on the activities of certain fraternal organisations. This side of things is disappointing, although I suppose one has to keep in mind that there was supposed to be a sister adventure game to go along with all of this, and that was presumably going to have all the more faithful Godfather-related goings-on and all of that. But due to circumstances already mentioned, that didn't happen, and the action game can't carry all that weight on its own. Reviews for the game were pretty mixed, usually depending on just how much weight the critique put on those graphics. Amiga Action didn't exactly cover themselves in glory with a frankly ludicrous score of 95%, while the future bods at Format and Power were a lot harsher, scoring at 46 and 56% respectively. The more negative reviews certainly made mention of the game's beauty as well, but they couldn't look past the tedium of actually playing it. As the Amiga Power review points out, they're reviewing games and not graphic demos. This was, alas, another example of what you usually got with creative materials. A small studio where the coders were talented, but often they had very little in the way of time or resources to complete a project. They were fixer-uppers, basically. Only a couple of people are credited with working on the nuts and bolts of this game. Tim Cannell did the version for the Amiga and ST, while Richard Applin ported that to PC-DOS. The DOS version perhaps does move a little bit better than the Amiga and ST, at the very least the frame rate is a bit more consistent, albeit consistently slow, but it's still much the same game, one that Applin himself described in one word as naff in an interview. Which, yeah, about sums it up really. And unfortunately, this was it. There were other versions of the game planned, but ultimately the game never left Computerland. Almost nothing exists on a version of the game for the Mega Drive. It was only ever mentioned in a September 1991 issue of the multi-format magazine Raise, where they reported that Delphine Software were working on it. Taking this at face value, one could wonder if the Mega Drive was going to get a version of Delphine's planned adventure game, but details are so hazy here that it's difficult to tell if the mag actually got it right. The C64 version, mentioned in magazines such as Commodore Format and GamesX, apparently never even got off the ground. Word was that Software Creations were going to work on this, but according to the game's entry on the almighty Games That Weren't, no work was ever started on a conversion to the C64. The mention of Software Creations is an interesting one, mind. Were they initially slated to work on the Godfather action game, full stop? Did something go wrong that then necessitated giving the project over to Creative Materials? Or did the magazine just get it wrong? Now, the Master System version is where things really do get interesting. Why? Well, because in early 1993 this actually got advertised and reviewed. There's box art for it, a review from a German mag called Video Games where it gets a, well, not exactly brilliant score of 41%, and even some video footage thanks to a Dutch TV show called TRS Powerplay, who covered it in January of 1993.
Spel The Godfather, waarin Vito Corleone, zoals hij eigenlijk heet, zich schietend een weg baant door de donkere straten van de stad.
And yeah, this game looks totally different to the one we got on the Amiga. Still side-scrolling of course, but we've got jumping here, which you can't do in the Amiga game, walking on rooftops, throwing grenades, some in-game music. The folks over at SMS Power have been doing quite a lot of digging on this one. From what they've gathered, it seems that Tiertex may have been working on this, although one also wonders if it could have been Software Creations. In any case, despite seemingly being finished, going by what's available, US Gold decided to pull this at the last minute, for unknown reasons. Perhaps there's more to find here, whether it's assets from the game or even a fully fledged ROM. But as ever, these things take time and lots of gumshoe work. So good luck to the folks out there trying to get more leads on it. And well, that about does it for a very middling action game that was supposed to be one part of a much bigger and more ambitious project. It was supposed to be a Don, but it ended up being Freddo. US Gold sent it out on a boat to Lake Tahoe, told it to say a Hail Mary, and then Al Neri fired a bullet into the back of its head. Laborious references aside, yeah, this isn't exactly the most memorable game in the history of the Kim Justice channel, although it does show that even the greatest and most revered movies of them all aren't safe from the clutches of the bog-standard licensed tie-in. Now, when we next look at a game based on The Godfather, we will be concentrating on something that is somewhat grander in scope. But until then, hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and as ever, bye for now. Wouldn't it be good if Konami were a reliable name once more? Something you could depend upon for quality, no matter where it was, rather than the miserable, shambling, turd-clogged cistern of a company that we've got these days? Nostalgia for the good days of Konami can be found everywhere you go, even in games that aren't actually by them. Now, the release of a great game like Shredder's Revenge naturally puts their classics back into focus, but even beyond something that direct, you find that call for the real Konami everywhere, anytime there's another smashing Metroidvania, or blistering Contra-esque run and gunner, or just a damn fine arcade-style game. It all ends up going back to something by Konami, a good thing that they used to do. Anywho, I thought that now would be a good opportunity to look back at a little selection of Konami's titles, ones that fit the bill of being both arcade games and licensed games. Konami didn't exactly shove such games down our throats. There's only 9 here, which seems like a ridiculously small amount compared to some of the stuff we've been covering lately, but they're pretty much all quality, some of the best games out there during that awesome arcade period of the late 80s and early 90s. Unbelievably, the high majority of them never made it to a home either. They were left in the arcade, an exclusive attraction that you had to go out and experience, the sort of thing you'd hotly anticipate playing again whenever a trip was on the horizon. Konami's style of arcade game, simple, big on characters, effective, was a match made in heaven for the licensed games they put out there, and so it's worth having a look back at the great stuff they did. And naturally, we're starting with the biggest game of the lot, the one that's once again on everybody's lips. In many ways, there's an unofficial holy trinity of 1989 when it comes to the beat-em-up, the 3 games that made pounding streets and whacking goons the hottest thing going, kicking the genre into overdrive after the likes of Double Dragon laid the groundwork. You've got Capcom's Final Fight, Sega's Golden Axe, and Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or Hero Turtles, if you're from these parts. And TMNT was unquestionably the biggest of the 3. It came out at the perfect time to really ride the wave that was Turtle Mania in 1990, when you had the movie, the cartoons, the absurd amount of toys, comics, advertising. The four Testodyne denizens of Manhattan were everywhere, and Konami rejoiced in its abundance. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was by some distance the biggest arcade game of 1990. It's one that's still more than remembered today. 32 years later, another game's established TMNT as, once again, the biggest thing going in the genre. And while Shredder's Revenge does plenty of cool new stuff, it utterly retains the core that makes this arcade so great, the absolute straightforwardness of the play, and the maniacal multiplayer that consistently brought groups to the big cabinet. Mind you, TMNT was neither Konami's first game using the license, nor was it their first 4-player beat-em-up. Konami were pretty quick to get hold of the Turtles license, picking it up pretty early on, late 1987, at around the same time that the cartoons started airing in America. The Turtles first appeared in game form on the NES in May 1989 through Konami's Ultra Games label, and needless to say this title was pretty successful. Now sure, it's kind of an infamously frustrating bastard of a game, what with its dam level, its corridor-filled technodrome, and a Raphael who is somehow even more useless than the support that April O'Neil offers, but it still sold somewhere in the region of 4 million copies. In fact, it's the best-selling third-party title on the NES. So long as we're talking about the NES title, did you know how crucial the game was to establishing Nintendo in the UK? The NES really didn't do well at all over here at first, being handled very badly by Mattel. However, when Sans Serif took over, they made the decision to pack TMNT in with the NES, creating the Mutant Machine bundle. Nintendo didn't even want this to happen at first, but the pack was a huge turnaround in the NES's UK fortunes, making the console a hot commodity in the Christmas of 1990. As far as the UK goes, it may well be even more important than those games featuring a certain Italian plumber. Naturally, having such a hot game featuring the Turtles on a home console was going to help out an arcade game no end. And for this arcade, Konami decided to expand on a formula they'd already created in another arcade from 1989, that one being Crime Fighters. In many ways, Crime Fighters is Konami's Double Dragon-esque game, and it's not necessarily a brilliant one. The game's sequel, Vendetta, kinda superseded it, and is a considerably better game. However, Crime Fighters was Konami's first 4-player beat-em-up, and it was a very popular unit at the time. You can see how it was a pretty good test run for what Konami were going to do with the Turtles. The team behind the game includes various people who would go on to be responsible for a lot of the other great beat-em-ups and arcades that we're going to see. The likes of director Gen Suzuki and Masahiro Inoue would work on plenty more of these games. The best way to describe the gameplay itself is that it's like Double Dragon, but simplified. You don't have as many moves as you've got in Technosa's game, but what you've got is very effective. There's your regular combo, a jump attack, a diving attack, and a special move, along with a little throw that you usually do as a finisher. Enemies die very quickly to the point where they don't even need a health bar, but there's often a ton of them in all shapes and sizes, so you've got to keep moving in order to not get surrounded. And the stages themselves are pretty short too, but absolutely packed full of big moments. Just take the first stage alone. You get the iconic intro, tons of Foot Clan to take on, big balls to avoid, droids coming out the ground, and then a big fight with Rocksteady. There's an awful lot of stuff in that first stage, which is pretty ideal for an arcade, really. It's a great experience whether you've got a bunch of people and you're aiming to complete the whole thing, or if you only had one coin to put into it. That first stage, whether you beat it or not, is definitely going to be worth putting that coin in. The game calms down a little bit from there, but is still basically packed to the gills with cool moments and ever more familiar enemies, not to mention the rest of the Rogues Gallery. Bebop, Baxter Stockman, Cran and more will have to be dealt with before the final fight with Shredder in the Technodrome. It goes without saying that TMNT absolutely nails the license. I mean, it's hard to see how Konami could have done much better. You get all the turtles, all the familiar characters and settings, some thoroughly appropriate music. It is basically flawless in this regard. Just the attract mode alone is a pretty awesome sight. Again, the visual of the turtles leaping from the building, theme song blaring out, was enough to get anyone playing. Now of course, anything with the Turtles name on it in 1990 was going to sell. Konami could have released one of those dreadful bootleg Keek style games with the Turtles on it, and people would have still played it. But happily, this game is a classic, and one that still holds up, especially if you can find it in a proper arcade setting. And unlike most of the games in this video, the huge popularity of the cabinet meant that there was going to be a whole load of home ports. We may as well talk a little bit about the various ports of TMNT, seeing as we won't be able to do that for most of these games. Most of the contemporary ports for this game are on 8-bit platforms, and naturally that means some things will be pared down a fair bit, but still some ports have their moments. Obviously though, the best port is the one on the NES by quite a long distance. Dubbed Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, to differentiate it from the previous NES title, it's about as good a beat 'em up as you can get on the console. It's smooth as hell, and it doesn't lose anything from the coin-op. In fact, it even adds a couple of levels. It doesn't skimp on enemies either, it's chock full of them. The great music's all there too. In short, it's brilliant, the sort of fine conversion you would expect seeing as Konami handled it themselves. The US version also features a sneaky bit of thoroughly appropriate sponsorship. Pizza Hut's got their branding all over it. A superb beat-em-up conversion, another big hit, and one that spawned its own NES-only sequel in the shape of TMNT 3, The Manhattan Project. That's also a good one, although it is kind of hard. There are also, of course, a whole load of microcomputer versions, the sort of thing I specialise in other words. They're a bit of a mixed bag. While some of the 8-bit micros are clearly very underpowered when it comes to this game, you would be surprised at how well they give it a shot. The Commodore 64 and Amstrad CPC versions of the coin-op certainly had a lot of effort put into them. You've got music and sound effects on the C64, and all the moves are intact. The C64 version actually manages to put a good amount of enemies on the screen, which is nice considering that the platform often really does struggle with beat-em-ups. The movement takes a little to get used to, but honestly it's fine once you do. One little disappointment is that while it might look as though the game can be played by 2 players, it actually can't. It appears that feature might have been taken out at the last minute. Still, it's quite good for what it is. The Amstrad version can be played by 2 players, and it also moves pretty nicely for the computer. Sure, it's nowhere near the NES version, but if you had this you wouldn't have been disappointed. There's no music here outside of the title screen, although some was composed and can be found on the disc. It appears as though this might have been dropped due to it slowing the game down way too much. Again though, a fine version. Alas, the Spectrum version is kind of awful. I've featured it a few times and yeah, it's not bad in the speed department, but the actual playability just isn't there at all. It's really frustrating to try and do anything, and it's not particularly impressive in any department. Still, it's not the worst version. The worst version would be the Amiga. Oh, good lord, this one's a disaster. A joke of an effort for a 16-bit conversion. You've got plenty of enemies, but it's so slow and juddery. It actually appears to move worse than the Atari ST version it was based on, and that ST version also had music. This doesn't have anything but very basic sound effects. The colours are horrid, the turtle appears to change their freaking identity in the middle of a move, things like fire hydrants and parking meters are more likely to hurt you when you hit them, the jerkiness is off the charts. Yeah, this one's a stinker. Well, that about does it for these ports, most of which were made by Probe and released by Imageworks, the last game the label released before their parent company, Mirrorsoft, went under the waves. Of course, there are many other arcade emulations of the game. There was one on Xbox Live Arcade, a rather sketchy version hidden on 2004's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 Battle Nexus, and it's naturally going to be on the upcoming Cowabunga collection for modern platforms, alongside most every other classic Konami Turtles game. The start of 1990 saw Konami release their take on Aliens in the arcade, a game that I did cover a fair while ago now, but hey, it's always worth another look. It's not exactly timed with anything specific in the franchise, seeing as the film was already 4 years old by this point, but hey ho, it's always worth doing a game based on aliens, isn't it? It kind of fits in with the other side of the franchise, that being the Aliens comics, the toy line by Kenner and so on, that were aimed at children, much more so than the actual film was. Not that a lot of kids weren't able to see Aliens, of course, I sure did back in the day. The Konami take on Aliens is a bit curious and certainly different from earlier games in the franchise that tried to be a whole lot darker and moodier, even with the rather limited tools at their disposal. Instead, this game is bright and colourful. The xenomorphs all come in a whole lot of different colours, and there's even the odd enemy that looks more like a zombie. Oh, and Ripley's had a bit of a dye job as well, with nice blonde hair. So yeah, the game perhaps doesn't have the tense Hadley's Hope atmosphere or anything like that, but it certainly has quite a lot of action. There's thousands of Xenos to splatter at all points, and the game plays like various classic Konami run and gunners. Not so much Contra, more an updated and considerably better version of something like Jailbreak. And naturally, two players can team up for the action, with the first playing as Ripley and the second taking on Corporal Hicks. You even have alternate endings depending on what you choose to do against the alien queen at the end. It's notable that a portion of the final boss fight features in the game's attract mode. That may seem odd, but hey, I presume Konami thought more people would put their money into the game if they know that they're going to be manning that power loader and shouting "get away from her you bitch" at some point, and they were probably right to do it. Generally, I really enjoy this one. It does seem to have held up quite nicely as well, certainly a great deal better than a lot of the other alien-based games of the time. You do get some neat little vehicle stages where you have to go and rescue newts that were mysteriously excised from the Japanese version of the game, possibly due to the inclusion of Newt herself breaking Japan's guidelines on portraying child endangerment in games. And you do have a few really awesome bits where you can commandeer a power loader to rip the Xenos and facehuggers to shreds with. It's a nice and fairly brief arcade experience with only a few stages, and it's another game that's pretty generous with the first credit. Generally most Konami arcades are, allowing most people a good 5 minutes or so with that first credit if you're playing a bit more casually, or you're just not that experienced with the game. It's nice to have a few decent weapons as well, particularly the flamethrower, which is always going to give those aliens a pretty tough time. On the whole, yeah, this is a definite gem of an arcade, and very much recommended for those looking for a slightly different sort of alien-based game. Unfortunately, this Aliens game never made it out of the arcade. However, there were certainly plans for it to be released in the home. Not a whole lot of detail exists, but it appears as though there were plans for a version of Aliens to arrive on the Mega Drive. The almighty Jazz Rignall of Mean Machines responded to a letter in the magazine in late 1990 saying that a version for the Mega Drive would probably be out in the middle of 1991. But alas, for whatever reason, it never showed up, and I'm unable to find any reason as to why Konami ditched it. I do wonder if perhaps there was some sort of messy situation with regards to the home console rights to the franchise, something that scuppered ports of the next game, but I certainly can't find anything concrete. It hasn't made it onto any compilations that I can think of either, although it is pretty easy to play this game on MAME and what have you nowadays, and you most certainly should. next, we go to March 1991 and another beat-em-up that was universally loved at the time. Having rode a big wave of Turtle Mania in 1990, Konami released their take on The Simpsons at just about the time when the first family of Springfield started to hit big, coming right in the middle of the show's second season with all sorts of merchandise appearing everywhere. Everything from figures and lunchboxes to characteristics and of course, Do the Bartman. And of course, there were games. Not just here in the arcade, but on the consoles and computers too. It kind of goes without saying that Konami's arcade game is the best of them by some distance, especially when it comes to Simpsons games from the early 90s. The Simpsons game doesn't exactly reinvent the wheel, it's the same highly successful formula that powered TMNT. The Simpsons bump into Smithers in the middle of a robbery, the prized jewel lands in Maggie's mouth, Smithers decides to nick the baby, and it's up to Bart, Lisa, Homer and Marge to get her back. Once again, as many as 4 players can join the fray and beat up a whole bunch of besuited goons, zombies, rabbits from Matt Groening's comic strip Life in Hell, and plenty other enemies. You have much the same moves as you do in Turtles, and the characters are a bit more diverse. Bart and Lisa are speedy, Homer packs a punch, and Marge, well, Marge is the best character by far, because she twats her opponents with a massive vacuum cleaner and has a ton of range. The Konami formula works just as well here as it does in Turtles. The graphics are brilliant and the presentation really goes the extra mile. Just about every character from the series makes an appearance here and there, and not just the regular ones. You've got the likes of Professor Werner von Braun, who serves as the first level's boss, or Princess Kashmir, who Homer can do a little dance with in Moe's Tavern. Certainly more than enough to satisfy fans of the show, and it all comes with a lot of nice music too. Not the best video game music ever or anything, but very suitable. The actual voices from the show are here too, at least for the Simpsons themselves. Smithers and Mr. Burns were voiced by programmers, but they're still well represented. It's also amusing to note some of the regional differences here, particularly between the Western and Japanese versions. In the Japanese version you can actually add to your health bar, the whole scoring system has changed, and you can even find tiny little nukes dotted around to throw. Yes, you can happily cleanse your opponents with fire every now and again. Mind you, these do appear in the Western game too, thrown around by the final Robo-Burns boss. There's a lot of other fun touches, including a cameo for Konami's earlier Aliens game, and it's fun to play the game often and try to find them all. The Simpsons game was quite rightly a huge success. This was the third biggest arcade of 1991, only beaten by the Neo Geo MVS and Street Fighter II. Just like Turtles, it was the sort of machine that you could find in just about every arcade, and it'd often have people huddled around it. Many folks have stories of their well-worn local machine, the sort where the controls for the more popular characters, usually Bart and Homer, would be knackered due to how often they were used. Ah well, like I said, Marge is the best character anyway. It's a tremendous game, of course. While there are certainly some other very good Simpsons games, from the almighty Hit and Run to the Crazy Taxi-esque Road Rage and EA's more in-depth title, this is still the best one for me. And therefore it is a shame that, again, like a lot of other titles in this video, you would struggle to find it in the home. Although the Simpsons arcade wasn't wholly absent from the more intimate setting. I'm pretty sure that the reason for the Simpsons arcade not coming home is straightforward. At the time of its release, the console rights for the show were held by Acclaim, who were busy releasing such utterly classic and riveting titles such as Bart vs the Space Mutants, which you could play on basically everything.
Oh, by the way, I was being sarcastic.
And so no Mega Drive or SNES version, I'm afraid. However, the home computer rights were still around, and Konami got them. Meaning that, thanks to Nova Trade, you can play The Simpsons on PC-DOS and, amazingly, the Commodore 64. The DOS version is a bit of a mixed bag. The graphics and movement aren't too bad, although the music is kinda terrible and a bit of a letdown. On the whole though, it doesn't play too awfully, and it does pretty much feature everything down to the arcade's minigames. The C64 version is kind of the real gem though. Sure, it's a ridiculously underpowered system and a very late game, but it's kind of amazing to see it here at all, particularly in a form that's actually quite playable where you've still got all the moves and even the cutscenes from the arcade kicking around. Yes, it is a little bit slow and all of that, but damn it, it's certainly trying. I think the C64's version of TMNT is better, but it's still good for a beat 'em up on here. Probably the saddest thing, to be honest, is that it's quite tricky to play the game officially nowadays. It was on XBLA and PSN in emulated form thanks to Backbone, but that's long been delisted. EA did release a rather bastardised take on the game for iOS, a sequel of a sort, called The Simpsons Arcade, at around the same time their bigger Simpsons game came out where you can only play as Homer, but that's also delisted. There is a 2021 Arcade 1-Up home cabinet release of the game, of course, but as far as something smaller goes, yeah, you're kind of out of luck at present, at least officially. Thank goodness for mainline. Naturally, Konami's biggest arcade license was going to get a sequel at some point, and sure enough, September of 1991 would see the release of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Turtles in Time. The evil Shredder and Krang have conspired to steal the Statue of Liberty. They even had the chutzpah to do it right in the middle of April O'Neil's news report. Needless to say, the Turtles have to nail these bastards, and they'll do so in an adventure that will take you from New York to a journey through the whole of time, dinosaurs, pirates, the Wild West. As one of the levels puts it, it's an adventure to where no turtle has gone before. Once again, it's a big old 4-player beat-em-up that, on the surface of things, isn't going to change an awful lot about what worked so well in the original TMNT, but Turtles in Time has plenty enough that's new about it for it to shine on its own merits. Turtles in Time certainly has a lot more flashy panache. Our heroes in a half shell have got a bunch more moves to play with, including a dash attack and a couple of thoroughly iconic grabs, whether it's slamming a foot soldier from left to right, or, most famously, throwing them directly at the screen. The levels are also a lot fancier too. The first utterly classic level, Big Apple 3am, features all sorts of big moments, from the gigantic Krang and his laser eyes to the big balls and the fight with Baxter Stockman, plus some legendary music to go along with it. And yet it just continues from there. Turtles in Time may not be too different to the original, but it kind of does beat it in every way. An absolutely magnificent beat 'em up, and yet another one that enjoyed a great deal of thoroughly deserved success. In fact, it might be the best game in this whole video. And not all of that has to do with the arcade version.
Forgot the sun cream.
Turtles in Time is most certainly blessed by also having one of the greatest home console ports there has ever been. A port that is so good, it's perhaps even more famous than the arcade original. It would be interesting to find out how many people think of Turtles in Time as a SNES game than they do an arcade title, but a lot of that has to do with how fantastic the port is. It quite simply doesn't put a foot wrong. Redubbed TMNT for Turtles in Time to continue the lineage from the NES's exclusive Turtles game, absolutely everything from the arcade is here. You would really struggle to find anything that the game misses out on, and even the graphics aren't really a whole lot different. One of the system's best soundtracks? Yep, we got that too. Turtles in Time is an all-timer in this department, the best music in the whole video, and it's beautifully done on the SNES. The port even adds a whole bunch of things. A couple of new stages, a legendary fight with Shredder where you chuck those foot soldiers directly at him. What a great port this is, seriously. One of those SNES games everyone remembers thanks to its stonking success and simply how good it was. It's no wonder a few people think of it as their favourite SNES game, really. Turtles in Time is still pretty much the pinnacle of the Turtles in video games, and it has to be on the shortlist of the very greatest beat-em-ups of all time. It's essentially flawless. Now, while the Mega Drive didn't get its own version of Turtles in Time, it did get the Hyperstone Heist, and that game is quite a lot like Turtles in Time, albeit with a slightly rejigged plot. Konami's first release on the MD features the new and improved Toy Tools, a bunch of stages, cutscenes and music from Turtles in Time, plus a little bit from the original and a few stages entirely of its own. I guess you could call it a rearranged version of Turtles in Time. It does sadly miss out on chucking enemies into the screen, and on the whole it isn't quite as good as the SNES game, but it's still a fine beat 'em up in its own right. I kind of remember a few magazines, UK ones at least, being rather sniffy about Hyperstone when it came out, giving it pretty low ratings. But over the years it's built up a following, and it's now regarded as one of the MD's finest beat 'em ups. And it must be said, it's got the price to match that. Excellent game. As far as more modern ways to play these games go, well, like the original, Turtles in Time was a hidden extra on a 6th generation Turtles game, TMNT 3 The Mutant Nightmare this time around, and again it's got a few unfortunate changes to the music and a lack in emulation. There was also the 2009 remake of the game for XBLA and PSN, Turtles in Time Reshelled, that, yeah, it wasn't particularly good, and the graphics have aged like fine milk. It sold well despite that, but it has been delisted since 2011. Happily, you'll be able to play the arcade and SNES versions of Turtles in Time, as well as Hyperstone Heist, on the upcoming Cowabunga collection. Konami weren't just going to hold things down when it came to the Turtles, oh no. They'd make games for the various cartoons that followed in its wake. Now, before some people start shouting, yes, it is a bit unfair to call Bucky O'Hare a Turtles imitation, seeing as the original Larry Hama and Michael Golden comic is a contemporary of the original TMNT comic, with both coming out in 1984. In fact, the creation of the character itself actually predates the Turtles by several years. That said, the big Bucky O'Hare push from 1991 onwards, complete with cartoon, big Hasbro toy line and Konami produced games? Yeah, that probably doesn't happen if it's not for the huge success of those Turtles. In any case, it's all about the games nowadays, and, shock of horrors, the Bucky O'Hare arcade game is really freaking good. The game that we end up with here is actually a bit closer to Aliens than it is to Turtles. We've got the big 4-player cabinet and the typical cartoon graphics, but be warned, because our heroes are now armed with shooters. You and your mates can play as either Bucky himself, Deadeye Duck, Jenny and Blinky, and you blast those evildoers of the Toad Empire to Kingdom Come through 8 stages that are, of course, utterly teeming with them. The game is ridiculously action-packed. If you were to consider this as a sort of sequel to Aliens in terms of gameplay, then it's an improvement in all departments, and it's not like that game's a slouch. You'll be flying along at points, doing the odd bit of platforming, avoiding traps, riding the obligatory elevator, and there'll certainly be big boss battles. The design and animation are thoroughly on point, and the actual voice actors from the cartoon are, once again, on hand. Bucky O'Hare certainly does follow Konami's formula to the letter, but it is a great formula, and it makes for another exceptional arcade. As the memory of this series has faded, it's not as well known as the likes of Turtles and Simpsons, but it's not exactly far off from them. As you might expect, this version of Bucky O'Hare didn't make it home, and it doesn't appear as though a conversion of this game was planned at any point. With that said, it's worth noting that Konami released a NES game based on Bucky O'Hare in the same year, and said game is an absolute belter. It is more of a classic NES style platformer in the vein of Mega Man and whatnot, but a very high quality example. You also have all the same playable characters as you get in the arcade, plus Willy DeWitt, although Bucky has to rescue them first. Once you rescue a character, you can switch to and from them at any time during a stage. One curious thing about this title is that it's amongst a small number of Konami games that could be, unofficially, considered treasure games, alongside the likes of Contra 3 and Axlay on the SNES. Almost everyone who worked on the NES Bucky O'Hare would go on to form Treasure later in the year, including the game's director and eventual company founder, Masato Maegawa. Neither the arcade or NES Bucky O'Hare have ever had any kind of re-release, and it would probably be silly to expect that they will anytime soon. If you fancy a copy of the NES game, you should probably be prepared to sell off a kidney or two in order to afford the bastard. The next one is possibly the most obscure of the games featured in this video. It doesn't seem as though Konami's take on the almighty Asterix really registered all that much back in the day, which is a bit of a shame. It's probably not even the most famous of the games that star the almighty Gallic hero and puncher of Romans, although it would definitely have a good shout at being the best of the Asterix games. Once again, we've got the typical Konami formula for a beat-em-up, although naturally there's only 2 players this time. You play as either Asterix or Obelix, his big brother from another mother, and your mission is basically to find as many Romans as possible and give them a solid punch-in, all the while scranning down loads of wild boar and getting the odd bit of help from your pet Dogmatics. It's kind of as straightforward as it gets for an arcade beat-em-up, and it's not like you need too much else from Asterix and Obelix. Once again, this is a game that gets by on how well it represents these rather famous characters. Like most of these games, it does an absolutely smashing job of that. I absolutely adore most of the attacks that you have at your disposal, particularly Obelix's ones. He starts every stage by carrying an absolutely massive bloody rock that he can flatten legions with, so what's not to love? Our heroes can grab enemies and slap them about, twirl them over their head or bash them from left to right without a care in the world, give them a right good kick up the arse, and do a really special power punch that's quite handy against a lot of the game's bosses. It all feels very right. It essentially feels like playing through the Asterix and Obelix comic, and that's most certainly what the game was going for. It may not have been the biggest of Konami games, perhaps due to the lack of familiarity certain audiences had with the characters, but it is a blinder. And hey, I'm sure it was utterly frickin' gigantic in France. If you don't know this one, and you like the classic Konami beat-em-ups, then yeah, you should absolutely fire this one up in MAME. Obviously, MAME is the only way to play this short of seeking out an original board. This has never been re-released, and it was never ported. Those fine French folk at Infogrames held the console and computer rights for Asterix, so there was no Konami Asterix console game, either a port of this one or anything else. There is an interesting tidbit about this game's development, mind you. The game's director is none other than the rather mysterious Hitoshi Akamatsu, the man who created Castlevania. Akamatsu is an elusive figure who never gave interviews and has long disappeared from the industry, but he moved back to Konami's arcade division following Castlevania 3. While he's credited as a director on Asterix, a recent Wireframe article about Akamatsu reveals that he wasn't quite fit for that job. The game's co-director, Masaki Kikuno, said that he pretty much had to do the direction himself and take all the big decisions. Akamatsu left Konami in the middle of the development of another arcade called Slam Dunk, and very little is known of him after that. April of 1992 sees the release in the arcades of G.I. Joe, another gem by Konami that was exclusively found on those sticky cigarette butt-filled floors. This game's a little different to the others in this video. It's another run and gun type shooter, but it's a scaling one where you run forwards into the screen. You play as one of 4 G.I. Joe operatives: Duke, Snake Eyes, Scarlet or Roadblock, and as is often the case, you can have as many as 4 players, which makes for a pretty wild game of Cobra Goon murdering and scenery destruction, of which there is plenty. You'll mainly be using your regular gun and moving your crosshairs about, but you can also get rapid fire power-ups and missiles that are pretty handy for taking down the bigger enemies and crowds. Nice. In terms of gameplay, G.I. Joe is an unofficial sequel to a 1988 Konami arcade called Devastators. Hell, it's so similar in parts that you could think of it as a remake. The original Devastators expands on a concept found in Contra's base stages. A similar view, only you run into the screen and there's scaling. Not a bad game, but it has some flaws. The regular weapon is a pea shooter, and much like Contra, it's not best served by being presented in portrait mode, or Tate mode as it's also known. G.I. Joe is a far better game. You've got a much more appropriate aspect ratio and a lot more power in your weapons, but the big addition is most certainly the amount of scenery destruction. If you can see it, chances are pretty good that you can blow it the hell up. And well, why wouldn't you? It is important to beat Cobra so frickin' hard that there is essentially no trace left of them, especially those oil tanks that are textured like Amiga boing balls. This is a thoroughly appealing bit of shoot 'em up action, and it does make for a nice change of pace from the main sort of games that we've got in this video. These were the times when Konami released Little Bit Gold no matter what they were doing, after all. If it feels like that was a long time ago, well, that's because it was. Sorry to tell you that. The bad news is, of course, that this G.I. Joe didn't come out in the home, although that's perhaps not surprising. This is one of those games from that very awkward 1992 time. It's too advanced for either the Mega Drive or the SNES to really do much justice to it, and by the time a console comes out that would have handled it nicely, well, the game's a couple of years old already, and everyone's moved on. The Revenge of Death Adder problem, in other words. In fact, it is surprising to find that this is Konami's only G.I. Joe game. I could have sworn that they did the 2 NES games based on Joe, but the first was from Taxan, and the second game, The Atlantis Factor, came from Capcom. I guess that's another reason why we didn't see a port of this one. The licensing for G.I. Joe looks like it was an absolute bloody mess. As you might have guessed, MAME or some other arcade emulation is your only option for playing this title, and it's absolutely one that you should play if you've not touched it before. We move along to another one of the more obscure Konami arcade licenses, and the game that is probably the weakest one in this video, although it is still quite decent on the whole. And naturally, it's a license that falls into the Turtles rip-off category. Yes, Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa is a much more blatant take on the winning formula, being that it's a quite short-lived cartoon series that was created by Ryan Brown, who was previously known for his work on the original Turtles comic. The series itself only lasted from 1992 to 93 and hasn't exactly stuck around in the public conscience, but it did hang around long enough to get a Konami game. In fact, Konami kind of got in on the ground level here. The game came out in November 1992, fast enough for the show to still be in the middle of its first season at the time of release. I guess that Konami were hoping for the show to be as big a hit as the Turtles was, but in this case, it wasn't to be. The series itself is this weird Wild West riff where a comet turns a whole community into these cow-human hybrids, and the result is a Wild West style town where typical Wild West stories happen, only everything is bovine. As far as Konami goes, said Wild West setting means that this is the unofficial sequel to a much more famous and better game by them. Cowboys of Moo Mesa is the follow-up to the almighty Sunset Riders. Now that game is one of Konami's most legendary of the whole period, 4-player run and gun action at its best, with tons of great set pieces, legendary bosses with famous speech samples. It's got the lot. Needless to say, these cowboys of Moo Mesa have a pretty freaking tough act to follow here, and comparing this game to Sunset Riders isn't going to do it any favours at all, because it just can't match up. However, it's not exactly bad. You can play as Marshall Moo Montana, the Colorado Kid, the Dakota Dude or Buffalo Bull, and you get to take down various members of the show's rogues gallery. It is certainly faithful to the show's style, which is down to the close involvement of Ryan Brown himself in the game's development. It looks very nice indeed. The main run and gun gameplay is perfectly fine, with no troubles if you're already a Sunset Riders fan, but the game falters a bit in the odd flying stages that are a bit of a pain to play, and with a lot of the bosses. Most of them are kind of dull, and they're little bit bullet cushions that take way too long to kill in this single player mode. It's just these minor things that take the game down a couple of pegs. That said, yeah, it's not a bad game at all. It's more of an intriguing curio than an essential title, but I had a bit of fun with it. Obviously, MAME is your only option here. This was never ported to anything, and it is the only Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa game that there ever was. Shocking, I know. And so we get to the final arcade game in the video. Another big and memorable cabinet housing another quite popular beat-em-up. It's the turn of the X-Men. It is certainly a lot less riskier to do a game based on this lot than it is to do one on those Wild West Cowboys. I mean, there had already been a few X-Men games by this point. Who can forget titles like the Uncanny X-Men on the NES after all? Naturally, this game is certainly a bit better than that one, although, no surprises here, it didn't make it to a home system, at least not for a good 18 years or so. X-Men goes back to the dependable formula that works. It's a good old-fashioned beat-em-up. The difference here, of course, is that X-Men is just that little bit bigger than the rest. Yes, this is the game that can feature a grand total of 6 players at once, depending on the cabinet. You and 5 of your friends can choose between Wolverine, Colossus, Cyclops, Nightcrawler, Storm and Dazzler, and naturally you've got to stop Magneto and his gang of goons from wreaking havoc on the world. You'll be fighting the likes of Wendigo, Pyro and the Juggernaut before getting to the Big M himself. As was the case with Konami's other big multiplayer beat-em-ups, you may find that too many people have got to the most popular characters before you did. The controls for Wolverine and Cyclops might possibly be knackered, but the controls for Dazzler are most assuredly near mint. If you're playing on the 6-player cabinet, it comes in a different resolution in order to accommodate the sheer amount of things going on. It's a double wide game, with 2 monitors inside the cabinet. One in the normal spot you would expect, the other inside the cabinet and reflected onto the screen to create the appropriate effect. Nice, eh? When you play this on MAME or wherever, you might well think that some things do suffer a bit in order to get this 6-player action going on. The game does only run in 30 FPS after all, and perhaps there could be a bit more variation in the enemies from time to time. Still, it's certainly no slouch when it comes to the sheer amount of goons. There's tons, and battering them up is certainly a good laugh. There's not a whole load of attacks, but you do get a special mutant power that helps clear the screen a bit when needed. Be wary, mind you, as deploying it naturally results in losing a bit of life. Happily, all the iconic X-Men moves are here, which honestly wasn't always the case with games from the franchise. Wolverine's always got his claws out, Cyclops shoots those lasers from his eyes, Nightcrawler dashes around and chins everything in seconds, and Dazzler fires energy from her hands. You can also kick people's heads in on the ground, and there's an attack and jump move as well. So yeah, you've got the usual Konami tools of the trade. X-Men is, once again, another fine beat-em-up, even if it's a formula we've seen a good few times at this point. It's not quite as good as the likes of Turtles in Time, but it's certainly doing an awful lot, and it does have the odd fun moment, whether it's the cheesy voice samples that occasionally display a rather questionable grasp of English, or the simple act of punching Pyro in the mouth in the middle of his obligatory villain speech.
X-Men, welcome to die!
It's all good, clean fun, and it made for another popular arcade. And of course, you couldn't play it at home. It's another game that was perhaps a bit too advanced for the home machines of the time. It did come home for a little bit thanks to an emulated version by Backbone available on XBLA and PSN in 2010, but this was delisted in 2013. All of these Konami beat-em-ups were on a limited license, and so they were all gone again after a couple of years. An arcade 1-up cabinet is around, featuring X-Men alongside Data East's Captain America and the Avengers and Avengers in Galactic Storm, but other than that, yeah, it's MAME all away. And it's a nice way to wrap things up here. Another good punch-a-thon that keeps up a very high standard. It is perhaps a little surprising that, in the end, we only have 9 games to show here, even if they are just about all worth playing at the very least. There are a couple of other licenses that Konami had where it's almost a bit of a surprise to not have an arcade version of the game, after all. What about their absolutely fantastic Batman Returns beat-em-up? An arcade version of that would have been more than able to hand with this video's best. Or TMNT Tournament Fighters, which is actually a not too bad attempt at the old Street Fighter formula, at least on the SNES anyway. And if you're looking for another Turtles rip-off, well, there's Biker Mice from Mars, which arrived on the SNES in the form of an actually very cool isometric racing game. All of these games are very decent indeed, but they were only made for the home consoles. Still, the games that we've ended up covering here comprise a group containing some of the late 80s and early 90s greatest arcades, and it's nice to have a video that contains absolutely nothing that's even approaching the land of badness. Hopefully you've enjoyed the look back at these cabinets, and it is once again time to say, as ever, bye for now.